Hi everyone, Stepan here. Today I'm going to start the series on the Grunfeld defense. This is going to be the introductory video in which I'm going to go over the basics of the opening, the main ideas for both sides, and the main line variations which can occur in the games. And then in 5 separate videos we are going to go over each individual variation in depth, in detail, and cover it thoroughly. Okay. So the Grunfeld defense is a hypermodern opening. Hypermodern opening in a sense that it doesn't follow the classical chess principles. It doesn't follow the classical rules which say develop, take over the center, and try to control as many key central squares as possible as soon as possible. So as opposed to, let's say, e4, e5, which is a classical opening and the classical defense to e4, where black simply controls as many key squares and stop white from doing the same thing, the Grunfeld is different. The Grunfeld starts after the move d4. Black plays the move knight f6, so doesn't challenge the center classically. White plays c4, which is the most principled response, and now this can still be several different openings. If black now plays e6, it will be the Nimzo-Indian defense most likely. There can be some other moves, but black follows this up with g6, and after g6, it's still unclear which opening this is going to be. White can continue with the move knight c3, but he doesn't have to. We are going to look at one other option a bit later on. But if he plays the move knight c3, which is the main and the most commonly played move, black now has a choice between two very popular openings. One of them is the King's Indian defense, which I have already gone over. You can find the whole series on the channel, which continues with bishop g7. Now bishop g7 and the King's Indian defense is also a modern opening. It also doesn't challenge the center, and even more so than the Grunfeld, it allows white to expand in the center immediately with e4. And now the point of all hypermodern openings, the King's Indian, the Grunfeld, the Peer's defense, the modern defense, is that you want to allow white to expand and create a broad center, which is going to be fairly strong theoretically, but then in compensation for that you are going to castle sooner, you are going to develop quicker, and you are going to strike at the center later on. And that's exactly what's the idea behind the King's Indian defense and the Grunfeld. Now in the Grunfeld defense, after knight to c3, black doesn't play the move bishop g7 and goes for quick castling. Instead of that, black strikes at the center now and stops white's expansion. Black plays the move d5. And the move d5, up until, I would say, the beginning of the 20th century, would have been considered ridiculous, and still visually, if you haven't been studying any hypermodern openings, it might seem much better for white, because white has the option of simply expanding further, even though black has tried to prevent that. So one of the most popular variations which we are going to see, I'm just going to show you to prove my point, is the exchange variation with cd5, knight d5, e4. And now black doesn't have a better option but to take on c3 and allow white to create this very solid pawn chain in the center, which allows for a lot of central control. If you look at which squares white is controlling, that's a lot of squares. To be controlling 5 squares like this in the center is considered to be a huge advantage according to classical chess. Okay, but let's go back. After the move d5, white is therefore fighting for central control. Now the second part of his plan, as in any other hypermodern opening, is as soon as white has committed to the strong center. So if we follow this variation once again, as soon as white has committed to the strong center, black is now going to start his idea of breaking that center open. One of the main pieces in the Grunfeld defense, nicknamed the Grunfeld bishop, same as in the King's Indian defense, is the bishop on g7. This piece is going to be your main weapon in the Grunfeld defense. Why is that? You can see, well, I'm using the exchange variation as an example, but in many other this is going to be so. This bishop is very strong. It's controlling the long diagonal in the position. It's the only developed piece for now, and it has a lot of prospects because of black's hyper-modern ideas. Let me just give you one example. Bishop c4, which is the main move, and black now continues with the second part of his plan. Once again, as opposed to the King's Indian, the Peer's, or the modern, where black castles immediately and only then strikes in the center, the Grunfeld is different because black doesn't wait. Because black waits with castling, he doesn't castle, he strikes at the center immediately, c5. And this is one of the most thematic positions of the Grunfeld defense. And you can see what's going on. White has a broad center. he is still 2 moves away from castling. Black is 1 move away from castling, and he is already putting tremendous pressure on white's center. So the d4 pawn is under huge pressure. Black can follow it up with knight c6. If knight f3 to defend, black can often undermine this defense with the move bishop g4, and basically all of black's play is going to revolve around breaking this key defensive point in white's structure. Okay, so that would be the idea behind the opening. So the Grunfeld is a very sharp opening, even though it's considered to be way less sharp than the King's Indian. I think it's more sharp than the King's Indian because the King's Indian is closed, and it often has a closed pawn structure with, let's say, e5, d5, with e5 for black, d5 for white, and often it's a locked center in which both sides have to look for pawn breaks. If you know the King's Indian, you will know that black will often play for the move f5 and try to break open the center. The difference is that the Grunfeld is already opened. The Grunfeld is an explosive opening because there are a lot of open lines. I've been playing the Grunfeld for about a year in between my Semislav defense. I took it as my main defense for about a year, and I got punished severely a couple of times because of the weaknesses the Grunfeld creates. Now, you have to understand that while black has a very strong bishop on g7 and is striking on the queen side, there are downsides to that as well, and white's broad center can be extremely dangerous. And you could divide the results in Grunfeld games into 2 categories. 1, white wins if he manages to withstand the pressure on his center and utilize the center, push it forward. And 2, black wins if he manages to destroy the center and stop white's pawns. I just want to show you one key thing in the Grunfeld defense. This is one of the most common Grunfeld endgame structures. This is the passed d-pawn in the Grunfeld for white, which is going to occur very often. I'm just going to show you one example of how something like that could happen. So we are still looking at the exchange variation. Let's say this happens, and black's put pressure on the center. This is an example variation. We are going to go over each one of these moves in the separate video on the exchange variation in depth. I just want to show you what I meant. So you can see what's going on here. If you compare this diagram with this passed d-pawn and this position, you can see that the idea is basically the same, and that it's possible to reach this endgame structure from this position. Black is often going to have a 2-to-1 on the queen side and the prospect of a passed pawn, and white is going to have a potential or a real passed pawn on d5, which can be extremely dangerous. This pawn is only 3 squares away from queening and is one of the main problems for black in the Grunfeld defense. I'm sorry, I'm outside, so we might hear crickets really loudly. Sorry about that, but there's nothing I can do. Okay, so one of the key features, one of the key dangers for black in the Grunfeld is the pawn storm white might create with his e4 and his d5 pawn. In this exact variation, this actually includes an exchange sacrifice, and the line is very sharp. But you can see that the Grunfeld is extremely imbalanced. That's what makes the position interesting, and that's what makes the position dangerous for both sides. There is nothing similar in positions for white and black here, as opposed to classical openings. This is dangerous, sharp. Play can develop quickly, games can end quickly, and it's not unreasonable to expect a quick tactical finish to the game or a quick transposition to a better endgame for either side. Okay, now a bit about the history of the opening. It was first played in 1855 in India by an Indian player, but the game was never recognized as official to give the opening its name. And the first game which was recorded, and then later on the name of the opening was given after the player, was played by Ernst Grunfeld in 1922, and he played the game against Alexander Alekhine, and he employed the Grunfeld defense so successfully that Alekhine apparently resigned by throwing his king in the corner of the room. So he must have been really upset. And one thing that speaks a lot about the Grunfeld is that later to become world champion, Alexander Alekhine employed the defense himself after that, and with great success. And since then, a lot of really strong players have played the Grunfeld. Kasparov, Fischer, Carlsen, Anand, Leko, Fabiano Caruana, countless very strong players have played the opening. One of the main exponents of the opening today is Peter Svidler. So if you want to study the modern theory in the Grunfeld and the most recent developments, I would turn to Peter Svidler because he is, I'm not sure, but I myself consider him the biggest expert on the opening. Okay, in the 5 videos that we are going to go over, we are going to be looking at 5 different variations. The first one is the exchange variation, which we saw just now, which starts after c takes d5. And this is the most common variation, the most common way for white to play, and perhaps the most critical variation. And since it's the most common variation on all levels, and especially on lower levels, I'm going to devote most attention to it. Okay, the second variation or the second branching we are going to look at is after d5. If white doesn't capture, doesn't exchange, he plays the move knight f3, and now black responds with bishop g7. Now the second most popular variation of the Grunfeld, and this big branching is called the 3 knights variation, but several continuations have their own name. The most important one is the Russian variation or the Russian system in the Grunfeld with the move queen b3, and this is what I've personally had most problems with. I hate this move. Okay, so dc4, queen takes c4, a very active queen castles, and e4. And in the Russian variation or in the Russian system, white still manages to expand, but with less danger to his center, even though the d4 pawn is not defended by the c4 pawn. This diagonal seems much safer with the pawn still on b2 and the knight still on c3. So the Russian system or the Russian variation we are going to work on in a separate video. After knight f3, bishop g7, we are also going to be looking at the modern exchange variation with cd5 now, and we are going to include that in the exchange variation video because the positions often transpose. Then in one separate video we are going to be looking at the Petrosian system or the Taimanov variation, which starts after the move bishop g5, and this is one of the most aggressive ways for white to play. I would say it's way more aggressive than the exchange variation in my opinion, and this leads to very sharp games. So the Petrosian system or the Taimanov variation is going to be another one we look at. And finally, well, not finally, we are going to be looking at the move bishop f4, which is the Brinkmann attack, and this can also lead to extremely sharp lines. But I would say that this is the most anti-Grunfeld white can opt for, because the plans are slightly different. You can see that the d4 pawn is in this case reinforced with e3, so the e4 pawn isn't pushed forward. So we are going to devote one video to that. And finally, we are going to be looking at the Neo-Grunfeld defense. The Neo-Grunfeld defense has a slightly different move order. So after the move knight f6, c4, g6, white doesn't play the move knight c3, which is the most common move. White plays g3. And now, depending on what white does, this will either be a Fianchetto King's Indian with bishop g7, which I have covered in a separate video in the King's Indian defense. You can have a look at that. Or if black plays the move d5, this is now the Neo-Grunfeld defense, characterized by the fact that the knight hasn't been developed to c3. Instead of that, white is preparing to Fianchetto his bishop. And this is another variation which I really didn't like facing when I was playing the Grunfeld, because black's diagonal can be extremely tender after c5. Okay, so these are going to be the 5 videos I'm going to do. So we are going to start with the exchange variation, then we are going to be looking at the Russian, then the Petrosian system, then the Brinkmann attack, and then the Neo-Grunfeld defense. I think that each video is going to be at least half an hour because there is a lot of theory. The Russian variation and the exchange variation might even be 2 videos each because there is a lot of theory. I'm going to try to be as succinct as possible, as clear as possible, and I'm going to try to give you the ideas and themes and patterns which you need to recognize, and not just variations, because learning the variations and the moves in the Grunfeld defense is close to impossible because there is so much theory. It is much better to learn piece placement, patterns which have to be recognized to play the opening properly, and the middle game plans and ideas for the side that you play. Okay, thank you very much for watching, everybody. If you have any questions, please let me know. I'm going to try to answer them all in the comments below. If you would like to support me, there is a link to my Patreon page in the comments below. I'm going to be publishing some extra content on the Grunfeld today, as I do with every daily video. And stay tuned for more chess. Bye-bye. Hi everyone. Stepan here. In today's video I'm going to continue the series on the Grunfeld defense with the exchange variation. The exchange variation is considered to be one of the main lines, and it is the most popular way for whites to play. So we have to devote a lot of time to it, and it has a lot of theory. There are a lot of things to know, but I'm going to try to share the plans, ideas and patterns which you can remember to make sure that you don't have to look at tons and tons of theory and endless lines of moves. Okay, so the opening begins after d4, knight f6, c4, g6, knight c3, and now black doesn't play the king's Indian. Black plays the move d5, Grunfeld defense, striking at the center immediately. And now, the most principled refutation of the Grunfeld visually should be the exchange variation. The exchange variation is simply taking on d5, so c takes d5, after knight takes d5, and there are no other moves because e4 is going to come. White plays the move e4, chasing the knight further away or forcing it to capture on b3. Now, knight b6 or knight f6 or knight anywhere else would be bad because the knight would be off, the knight would be misplaced, and it would also serve as a future tempo gain, especially on f6. So there is no better move for black but to exchange the knight on c3. And after knight takes c3, b takes c3, black now continues his hyper-modern idea of breaking open the broad center white has just created. The whole idea behind the Grunfeld defense is allowing white to create a broad center with e4, d4 and c3 in the case of the exchange variation, and then to break it open later on. Bishop g7 is the start of that. You are using your best piece, your most important piece, your Grunfeld defense bishop to control the long diagonal and to aid you in destroying the center, namely the d4 square, which is the most significant point. Okay, and we are going to be looking at a lot of different moves for white. The two most important moves are bishop c4 in this position, and that's the most common move, and knight f3 is the second most common move. We are also going to be looking at four different sidelines: bishop e3, bishop b5 check, queen a4 check, and bishop g5. But we are going to be focusing on bishop c4 and knight f3 the most. Okay, before I continue with the theory, I want to discuss some key points about this position, and I'm going to use pawn structures to show that. So this is the position we have here, just with the pieces of the board. The point of black's play here is to put as much pressure on d4 as possible, and the arrows here signify the pieces he does that with. The most important thing is the c5 pawn. The c5 pawn is going to advance from c7 to c5, thus attacking the d4 point and the d4 pawn. Now the problem with that for white is that he cannot just take on c5. Even if he could, that might not be the best option, but he cannot take because of the g7 bishop in the Grunfeld, which is often staring at the a1 rook. And we are also going to see some positions in which white actually gives up this exchange. So c5 is a hard move to meet because you cannot take, and you cannot advance your pawn to d5. Once again, if you look at this position, the king is still on e1. Once c5 is played, you can see that d5 can be met with bishop takes c3 check, actually winning a whole rook, or winning the exchange because of bishop d2. So there are a lot of problems for white after this move c5. So white is going to try to withstand the pressure on the center, black is going to try to break it open. Now the second move, with the c5 pawn and with the g7 bishop, is the d8 queen. You can see that the d8 queen is already perfectly placed to put pressure on d4. And fourthly, one piece which is going to be very significant in the attack on white's center is the knight, which is going to come from b8 to c6. And from c6, of course, once the c5 pawn has moved, is going to exert pressure on the d4 pawn. So this is one of the main features of the Grunfeld center. Now, the second thing is this exchange. Once c5 happens, and black is almost always going to take on d4, after c takes d4, we have this pawn structure. And this is the exchange Grunfeld endgame pawn structure which occurs most often. Now, plenty of people argue that this is drawish if you know a lot of theory, and indeed there are variations which go 25 or 30 or even 35 moves deep in which you have theoretical draws on the highest level. But in a practical sense, this is a very imbalanced endgame. Now, the first thing we can see is that each side has a potential passed pawn. White's potential passed pawn is on d4. Black's potential passed pawn is at the moment at b7, on b7. So each side is going to try to push their pawn, create imbalances. Now, one thing that should be said is that white is often faster. Why is white faster? Because black is going to have a knight on c6 sometimes the bishop is going to be on e6. There are going to be pieces in the center, and very often the move d5 or the move e5 are going to come with tempo. Okay, the third main feature of the Grunfeld exchange variation is the c4 square, and this I would like to highlight specifically. Okay, so what's the point of the c4 square? So as soon as the exchange variation happens, let's go over that once again. So knight c3, d5, c takes d5, knight takes d5, e4, knight takes c3, b takes c3, we have this pawn structure. And in this pawn structure, the main weakness for white is the c4 square. Why is the c4 square weak? Because white can no longer defend it with a pawn. The only case in which white could reinforce the c4 square with a pawn would be if white had a piece on b3. Let's say white gets his knight b1, d2, or let's be more precise, knight f3, knight d2, knight b3, and let's say black has a knight on a5, and black for some reason takes, and white recaptures, in which case the a2 pawn would come to b3, white would be able to play c4, reinforce his structure, and probably be winning strategically. But if that doesn't happen, and if black is using his brain, he is never going to exchange on b3, then the c4 square can be used as an outpost for black's pieces. Most importantly, is going to be an outpost for the knight. The knight is going to come to c6, then to a5, then to c4 in many cases. So when playing the Grunfeld and facing the exchange variation, always keep in mind the c4 square as one of the strongest squares you control in the position, and one of the squares that white cannot contest in any way. Well, except with his pieces. Okay, now, theory. I'm just going to mention the sidelines briefly before we start. Okay, the move bishop g5, first of all, in the exchange variation, is not precise, I would say, and I don't like the move bishop g5. Black continues with his normal plan, disrupt the center, c5, rook c1 by white, trying to control the center, and now black castles, simply castles. Still there's a lot of pressure. Now, of course, d5 would actually be possible and is one of the options because the rook is defending the c3 pawn. So d5, for example, queen d6, knight f3, bishop g4, bishop e2, knight d7, castles. I don't think bishop g5 is such an important move. It's still a sideline. It has been played, let me see how many times, about 250 times. And it's a move you have to know, but black doesn't really have that many problems. Just continue with c5, castle normally. If d5 happens, you continue with queen d6 and bishop g4, pinning the knight, and bishop e2, knight d7, castles. You are fine here. You have a 3-2 pawn majority on the queen side. An exchange didn't happen on d4, but you still have a potential to create a passed pawn on b4, and white is still going to try to create his. Now, you have a lot more control over e5, which is good. Okay, after bishop g7, another sideline which might seem tricky are the checks with bishop b5 check and queen a4 check. Now, after bishop b5 check, the main point of this is to provoke the move c6, which doesn't really do that much in my opinion. Bishop a4 castles, knight e2, and now the pawn can advance to c5, and it will advance to c5. So the thing white got is a bishop on a4 instead of a bishop on f1, which you could argue is useful. Castles, knight c6, and black continues with his normal plan. Now the main move here is bishop e3, but one tricky move has been played, and that's bishop takes c6, b takes c6, doubling the pawns, but I think that white is almost lost here, even though the engine gives it as equal. But you need to keep that in mind because the option might seem tempting. After bishop a3, attacking the pawn, cd4, bishop a6. I just don't like this position for white. Black has a weakness on c6, that's correct, and the pawn is pinned on e7, but I would say that this is just too much pressure on the center, and I would much rather be black here. Okay, and the move queen a4 check can be met two different ways. One of them is queen d7 blocking with the queen, to which queen b3 should be played after bishop b5 if it's played, and c6 once again, bishop e2 castles, and I don't see why white would be better here. Your plan once again is going to have to be advancing your pawn to c5 after the pin has been removed. And after queen a4 you can also play the move knight d7. After knight d7, knight f3 castles, bishop e2 c5. The knight is now reinforcing c5 and importantly controlling the e5 square. So if the pawn should advance to d5, then you would have a good square on e5 as well, and also looking at c4. The main line here is castles, cd4, cd4, knight c5, which works tactically because if dc5, rook takes, bishop takes a1 rook, and that's one tactical variation which I once again like for black. After the move e5 you now have to start saving your bishop, queen c7, queen f4 because the e5 pawn was threatened, and now bishop c3, you want to be rerouting your bishop or exchanging it on d7. And these sidelines have to be mentioned, but I don't think they are going to happen that often. The last one is bishop e3. This is actually a more common move than the queen checks and bishop g5, and this is a normal developing move which actually does reinforce the center, so I think it's very sensible. If white doesn't play bishop c4 or knight f3, this is probably the best option. Black still continues with c5, d5 and d takes are impossible because of the c3 pawn, and now white continues with queen d2, defending c3, so now any advances actually are possible, and black continues with queen a5. So now once again reinforcing the threat on the center, now pinning this this pawn to the queen, so if any exchanges do happen, it's going to be, I'm sorry, not pinning the pawn to the queen, but if any exchanges or captures happen, then bishop c3 wins the queen. Okay, now white has two options, white has two options. Rook c1 is probably the best one, rook b1 is the second one. Rook c1 reinforces your center and reinforces the c3 pawn. Black is now going to play either cd4 or castles. I think that castles is the sideline here. Knight f3, rook d8, d5, e6. Once again the same plans of undermining the center, and white trying to sustain it with his rook and with his queen. So nothing major going on here, and if you know the plans in the Grunfeld for black, you don't have to study each one of these variations separately until you get to, I would say, above 2000 or 2100. It's more important to know the ideas in these variations than the exact move orders. So bishop e3 is a sort of move you're going to be accustomed to playing against if you know the plans in the Grunfeld. Okay, and now to make sure this video isn't 20 hours long, I'm going to get to the two main moves, bishop c4 and knight f3. Let's look at knight f3 first. This is the so-called modern exchange. Black is going to continue with c5. So for black, remember your plans, c5, try to disrupt the center. The problem with knight f3, as opposed to bishop c4, is that the move bishop g4 comes with a pin and actually removes the support on the d4 pawn. You can see that if black had played knight e2 instead of, I'm sorry about the crickets and about the noises, there are some children crying in the neighborhood. It's all fine, they're just young. Okay, where was I? Okay, yeah. So the difference between knight f3 and knight e2 is that the knight on e2, and that we are going to see in the c4 lines, cannot be pinned with bishop g4 because white has the option of f3, still keeping the defense of d4. And the knight on f3 can actually pretty effectively be pinned with the bishop on g4 because it's now threatening to remove the defender and take, similar to what happens in many classical openings. Okay. So, after knight f3 c5, bear in mind that the move bishop g4 is an option always with black because you can easily remove one of the defenders. We're going to look at 4 different moves for white here. I'm going to mention the sidelines first. The first sideline is bishop e2, which is a calm developing move and it makes a lot of sense. Knight c6, black plays normally, his own setup, going for the d4 pawn. Bishop e3, and now the point of the weakness of knight f3, bishop g4. And now if white doesn't react fast, let's say white just castles, you are already in trouble here. And what do you do here? If you take, then knight takes, bishop takes, doesn't matter, you win a pawn, you win the game. White doesn't have prospects of a passed pawn, and black still has his 2-1 majority on the queen side, and that's, with correct play, going to be enough to win. So after bishop g4, white has to play correctly, and this knight f3 idea has been not pioneered by Kasparov, but I think he actually introduced it as a very strong weapon, and it was played way more often after Kasparov had played it. So white needs to do something. White plays e5, and after e5, of course, the pawn isn't hanging. What we have is cd4, castles, and now queen c7. The position got a bit calmer, and we have the exchange variation pawn endgame structure, with white wanting to push and create his passed pawn on the d file, and black going to push b5. Okay, the other move I want to look at after knight f3 c5, another sideline, is the move bishop b5 check, which also does make a lot of sense, and if you haven't seen it before, you might blunder, but if you know it, then it's fine. This move you just have to know, and I would encourage you to go over this part of the video if you need to several times to make sure you remember this. Bishop b5 check seemingly stops knight c6, and knight c6 is the move you want to play in your setup. You want to attack d4. So if black plays knight c6 anyway, you might be wondering why d5 isn't a move, and why d5 isn't a playable option which can win the knight. Of course, the knight is now pinned to the king, and the knight cannot move, but there's a trick. Okay, there are two moves here, either castles or d5. Castles is way more popular because d5 doesn't really work. Okay, and let's see why. If d5, black has the only move, queen a5, and now if pawn takes knight, then queen takes bishop. So white plays rook b1, defending the bishop, so now once again reinforcing the threat of pawn takes c6, and black plays a6, chasing the bishop away, so now forcing the bishop to take. Bishop takes c6, b takes c6, castles, and you can see that white has given up the bishop pair in a position with an open center. He has a loose pawn on c3, a loose pawn on a2, and just a very loose position which is going to crumble with correct play from black. A bishop is way more powerful than a knight here. And that is why after bishop b5 you can play knight c6, because d5 is not playable. White is going to continue with castles, and you're simply going to take cd4, and after cd4, castle. And now once again, we have the same structure, e4, d4, b7, a7. Black wants to advance on the queen side, white wants to advance in the center. And here the variations are fairly simple. White develops, black plays his bishop g4 once again, increasing the pressure on d4. And now to relieve the pressure, white does the same thing. Bishop takes c6, b takes c6, rook c1. And if white is forced to give up his bishop to get rid of the pressure, then black should be fine. You do have a structural weakness on c6 though, and it's not that easy to create a passed pawn anymore, but the c6 pawn is now reinforcing d5. Queen a5, you want to trade a2 for c6. Queen d2 defending and offering a queen trade, takes, rook fd8, offering a trade once again, rook c6 for bishop d4, knight b3, a5, rook c6, just trying to remove the defender. After the knight moves, an exchange happens, and this should be equal. On high levels this should be a draw. Practically though, I would prefer to have white, because his knight is in my opinion better than the bishop. If black can fix his pawn on a dark square, if white can fix his pawn on a dark square and try to get a more active position, I think he might be better, especially because f3 is blocking the route for the bishop, and the bishop doesn't have that many squares. Okay, now let's continue with the main move here. After knight f3, c5, the main move is rook b1, and this move is one of the reasons that the Grunfeld was considered to be almost busted, and this move has been played heavily during the 80s and the 90s. The move rook b1 is really tricky, and it leads to a pawn sacrifice, which leads to huge initiative for white. And when I played the Grunfeld for the 1 year, I didn't like facing this move. I think it's just better for white. So, rook b1 castles, black castles, disrupts the center. Bishop e2, developing. And now this trick that black has, or this option to win a pawn. cd4, cd4, queen a5, check. And now you can see that this is a double attack. Attacking the king and attacking the a2 pawn. So bishop d2 and queen takes a2. After white castles, this position has been very heavily analyzed, and this is one of the main positions in the Grunfeld defense. Apart from the main line of the bishop c4 variation, which we are going to see, the classical exchange variation, this is the key position you have to know, and this is what's most often going to happen in your games. After knight f3, that is. So what's the point? Black has an extra pawn and a 2-0 pawn majority on the queen side, two connected passed pawns. Now what's the problem? A lead in development for white. All of white's pieces except for the queen have been developed, and a huge initiative in the center. These two pawns mean a lot. These two bishops can cause a lot of problems. And one key thing is that whenever black moves his queenside pawn majority, that's going to create weaknesses, and the pawns are going to become targets. If you look at these two bishops, they are placed perfectly to stop the queenside pawn majority and even to block it. So very often this majority cannot be utilized until a successful conversion to an endgame. If you turn on the engine, this position is almost +1 for white, and black is a pawn up. Now, if you let your engine think for a long while, it's going to reduce the advantage, but it's still better for white. Now, how does black continue? This line is pretty forced, and this is the good news. So with black, you need to know this. You need to know everything up until move 20. If you want to outplay your opponent with theory, then know more. So, bishop g4, once again trying to remove the defender of d4. Bishop g5. You are not afraid of bishop takes e7 because of rook e8. So h6, bishop e3, knight c6, d5, and now bishop takes f3, bishop takes f3, knight e5. And this is sort of the starting position of the modern theory. Rook takes b7, you're giving the pawn back, and now a5. And this is the main line for a reason, and this has been played most often. You need to try to utilize your pawn. You have given up the b7 pawn, it doesn't matter. You're going to give up your e7 pawn, it doesn't matter. You want to create problems with this pawn. You are not even interested in taking the bishop. You want to play a4, a3, a2, and queen, or at least cause enough trouble to make sure white has to give up some material, an exchange, or something else to stop you. Your bishop is really strong, your a8 rook is really strong, your queen on a2 is really strong, and this should be your plan. Let's say bishop e2 is played, knight c4 is defended by the queen, and now after bishop f4 you want to play a4. Rook takes e7, doesn't matter, a3. And this is the idea. So that would be the move knight f3, and after knight f3, c5, as I said, rook b1 and the pawn sacrifice is the main thing you have to know. And after bishop g7, bishop c4 is the main move and the move you need to know best. This is the main line of the exchange. Now once again, as in all variations, black continues with his one idea, c5. Now knight e2. The difference between knight e2 and knight f3, as I said, is that bishop g4 doesn't really work because f3 can be played. Now there are two moves here, but they're going to lead to the same position most of the time. So let's look at knight c6, which is considered to be the main line. Knight c6 attacking d4, bishop e3 defending d4, castles, and now bishop g4. And if the knight was on f3, white would be in trouble. Since the knight is on e2, white can play the move f3. And black argues that this move is weakening and that it's worth provoking it because the position for black is better with the pawn on f3 than with the pawn on f2. You could say that's true. Because the dark squares are under pressure, then weakening a dark square diagonal makes sense. After f3, black doesn't have to move the bishop immediately. Black can play the move knight a5. And now the c4 square comes to mind. In the main line, there is going to be trouble on the c4 square for white. Bishop d3, retreating the bishop, and now still not moving the bishop away from g5, but c takes d4, attacking the bishop. And after c takes d4, now once again, you are under attack. Now you do have to move, and now bishop e6. And now in this position, after bishop e6, we have one of the craziest lines in the Grunfeld. This is now move 13. And after bishop e6, white doesn't have to play this, but is the best way to play d5, and the most interesting way to play. d5 is very aggressive, of course, giving up the exchange, so why not take? Bishop takes a1, queen takes a1, but for the exchange you have given up your Grunfeld bishop, and the position gets tricky. Mind that black doesn't have to move the bishop away, because the queen is going to take on d3. So f6, stopping e5, making room for the bishop if necessary, even though the bishop is going to go to d7 most often. Bishop h6. Rook e8, king h1. It's important to stay off the dark squares because they could be used as a tempo gain and to win some pieces. Rook c8, developing. Knight f4, attacking the bishop. Now, bishop f7 has been played, but it's not as good. You need your bishop on this diagonal, so bishop d7. And now e5. e5 is not a pawn sacrifice because the queen is defending it. It's threatening e6. And it's also double attacking the g6 pawn, so now things get crazy. Knight c4, getting your knight in the center, defended by the rook. e6, bishop a4, ideally you want to play b5, a5 and start. And now the sacrifice. This is the best move for white and the most commonly played move for white, and you're going to win an exchange for it. If you want, you can pause the video, but I think it's fairly obvious. Knight takes g6, and you have to take. Pawn takes, bishop takes. And now you're losing an exchange, and you are getting under pressure, so the best way to defend is knight e5. And believe it or not, white doesn't take the exchange. White doesn't play bishop takes rook on e8. White plays bishop e4. This bishop is much more effective in the attack and in the center of the board than this stupid rook on e8. Bishop c2, trying to challenge the bishop. And now bishop takes, rook takes. And you might wonder why this is played, why you allow this trade to happen. But I think that white argues that still it's more worth it to trade the bishops off than to take the exchange. In the positions with knight e5, bishop takes, I think that white would sort of lose his initiative. And if the pieces get traded off, then this structure is going to be a weakness, and if black can blockade it and target it, black might win because of the pawn majority. So that's why bishop e4 and bishop c2 takes. In this position, queen d1 is played and king h7, begging white to take the rook and then for black to take the bishop. If you turn on the engine, this position is completely equal. And this is why the grandmasters played. Let the engine think for a while and it's going to say that it's closer to equal. I don't think this is realistic. So, a tricky line, and the good news is that you only have... Well, let's go back. I know this was a lot of information. d4, knight f6, c4, g6, knight c3, d5, the exchange variation, knight takes, e4, knight c3, bc3, bishop g7. The two variations you have to know by heart is knight f3, c5, rook b1, leading to a pawn exchange, and bishop c4 and the main line here, which is a bit more complicated and has a bit more theory, but is way more forced. And after bishop c4, there is a lot less theory to know. So remember to learn bishop c4 and the whole line after that. And remember to learn after bishop g7, knight f3, c5, rook b1. Those are going to be the two most common variations. Okay, sorry about the quantity of the information. I had to cover all of this because it was important. I hope you understood it and that you liked the video. If you have any questions, I will always try to answer as best as I can. If you would like to support me, check out the link to the Patreon page in the description below. I will be creating extra content for patrons for the exchange variation. Today there will be some tasks and a more detailed explanation of some variations. Thank you very much for watching and stay tuned for more chess. Bye bye. Hi everyone, Stepan here. Today I'm going to continue the series on the Grunfeld defense with the Petrosian system, also called the Taimanov variation. But I think it's better to call it a system than a variation because there are multiple lines and it's basically a setup rather than a variation. Okay, so let's get into the opening. If you haven't seen the introduction to the Grunfeld defense, I've made a video on the basics. Make sure to watch that before you continue. Okay, so d4, knight f6, c4, g6, knight c3, d5, the Grunfeld defense. And now we are not going to be looking at the exchange variation anymore. We are going to start looking at the move knight f3. This is the three knights variation. And after the move bishop g7, this can still lead to multiple different lines. Queen b3 is the most popular move here, leading to the Russian variation. We are going to cover that in the next video. Today, we are going to focus on the move bishop g5. And the move bishop g5 is similar to the Brinkmann attack, to the idea of the Brinkmann attack. And it has the idea of moving the bishop outside of the pawn chain before closing it down or playing the move e4. It also tries to undermine the knight on f6, although it's not that common to take the knight, or it's not common at all. So the purpose isn't to take on f6. The purpose is to get the bishop to a very aggressive diagonal using the fact that black has already committed to fianchettoing his bishop. So any moves such as h6 followed by castling are going to be weakening the king further on. And in some variations, white can continue with queenside castling, trying to put a lot of pressure on black's kingside, as we are going to see. Now, black has several responses to this move. All of them are logical. The most common one is using the fact that the bishop can be used as a tempo gain. So the move knight e4 is the most common move, simply attacking the bishop. We are going to look at the sidelines first, but this is by far the most common move and the best move. After bishop g5, two other moves are possible. One of them is really passive, and I would advise against it. Now, this position after bishop g5 is equal according to the engines, so bishop g5 is not the most principled move for white. That is why black needs to play aggressively, he needs to play precisely, and he cannot play passive positions in which he wants to seek equality, because equality cannot be found here if you play passively. So one move that is common is c6, simply reinforcing the d5 pawn. But now white stands better. White sort of has an improved Slav position with black fianchettoing and the bishop already outside of the pawn chain. So white can simply continue with the move e3, closing down the position, defending his c4 pawn. And after black castles, white plays something like bishop d3. Black now uses the fact that the bishop has already developed and now takes on c4, dc4, bishop c4, h6, chasing the bishop away, bishop h4, knight bd7. This is very pleasant for white. This position is safe. White doesn't have any problems. He's going to castle on his next turn, and it's not that easy for black to break the Grunfeld center open. So ideas like c5 are still in play, but it's not that dangerous, and white sort of has an easy game here. That is why I would advise against the move c6 after bishop g5. c6 is a normal move, and c6 isn't a bad move per se, and you can play c6 if you don't know the theory, and I think that most commonly people continue with c6 if they don't know how to play against the Petrosian system. But I'm going to show you two options which are way more active and better. The first one is the most common sideline, and I don't think it's as good as the main line, therefore it's a sideline for a reason. And in the sideline you simply use the fact that the c4 pawn is en prise and you take the pawn. D takes c4. Now, this idea resembles a lot of positions from the Slav and the semi-Slav, the Botvinnik semi-Slav and the anti-Moscow and stuff like that, where black tries to win the pawn. The difference is that your bishop is a Grunfeld bishop, it's fianchettoed on g7, it's not coming to e7. So black has a lot more pressure along the diagonal. Now, white can continue in two ways. White can either play the move e3 or the move e4. I don't have to say that e4 is way more aggressive. The difference is that in Slav and semi-Slav positions, when e4 is played, black always has the option of playing the f8 bishop to b4, and reinforcing the pawn with b5. In this position, if b5 is played, then black is simply going to capture the pawn. It doesn't really work. The c6 pawn hadn't moved. Usually in the Slav and the semi-Slav, of course, the pawn is already on c6, so queen a5 check is an option which can be played. So in this case, if b5, knight b5, queen a5 check, knight c3, black would have the move bishop b4, double attacking the knight, with knight e4 ideas coming to mind. And it's going to be a theme in these openings as well, in these positions as well, and you have to mind the fact that black has the option of knight e4. Now, after the move e4, and we are going to look at e3 later, black continues in the most principled Grunfeld fashion, c5, and white doesn't really want to trade the pawn. white doesn't really want to take on c4 yet. White wants to reinforce his center, push it forward, and he plays d5. And now we have the Grunfeld pawn on d5, which is going to be really dangerous. It stops the development, the easy development of the light squared bishop from c8, and it puts a lot of pressure on the center. You can see visually immediately that the b8 knight doesn't really have that many good squares, and it doesn't have c6, doesn't have e5, so this pawn is a problem. Now, what black gets in compensation is trying to save his extra pawn. So in this position, black still has 8 pawns. You can see that 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. White has 7 pawns, so black has taken on c4. And in order to save his pawn, and this might seem counterintuitive, but you need to know the theory to play it, black plays the move b5. Now, taking the pawn for white is impossible. If the knight takes the pawn now, when the c-pawn has moved, and that's sort of similar to what you have in the Slav defense, if the pawn is taken, black simply plays queen a5 check, trying to win the knight. And if the knight retreats back to c3, all of a sudden knight e4, and there is triple pressure on e4, and white basically loses the game. There is no way to save this position. It's going to be dead lost. Black is going to be a pawn up, and the white king is going to be stuck in the center. So after the move b5, the best way for white to continue is e5, chasing the knight away. And now, if the knight moves away, then knight takes is actually a possibility, because let's say black plays something passive. Let's say this happens. Knight takes, queen check, knight c3. You no longer have knight e4. You can no longer put pressure on the knight with the bishop, and this should now be winning for white. Therefore, after the move e5, black needs to continue playing aggressively. And this position is equal, but it's equal if you know the moves. It's equal if you know the theory. Now, retreating the knight is not an option, as I said, because the b5 pawn is going to hang. Therefore, black plays the very aggressive b4. Now, the c4 pawn is unpre, the f6 knight is unpre, and the c3 knight is unpre. And the best variation for white is ef6, and black continues with ef6, still double attacking two pieces, making bishop take c4 impossible. But white is able to use the fact that the black king is still stuck in the center, and he can check with the queen. Of course, bishop e6 loses a piece. Queen e7 is not a good move. If black plays queen e7, well, okay, I'm going to turn on the engine for this one. If queen e7, queen takes e7, king takes e7, and yeah, once the bishop retreats, it's going to be less favorable for black, because if the bishop retreats and black takes here, I think white doesn't have to capture, losing the exchange, of course. Let me just check that. Oh yeah, I'm sorry, the pawn is still on f6. I'm sorry about that. I kept thinking that my bishop is open. Okay, so this doesn't work because white would simply have 6 pawns and a healthy pawn structure, a lead in development, and his king would be able to castle, and the c4 pawn is still dropping. So black is going to give up his extra pawn eventually, and white is going to be better. So after the move b4, we have e takes f6, e takes f6, queen e2 check, and the best move is king f8. You don't want a queen trade. After the move king f8, white now saves his bishop to e3, and now b takes c3, and b takes c3. Once again, the bishop is still behind the f6 pawn. And this should be equal or slightly better for black. It's aggressive, and it's very complicated, and it's highly likely that you are going to lose your c4 pawn and your c5 pawn, but you have a lot of pressure on this diagonal, and it could be fairly tricky for white to defend this. From this position, the most common move is knight d7, simply developing and defending c5. You can also play king g8, you can play bishop a6, trying to defend c4. And there are multiple options. f5 is not a good move here. I think that after f5, yeah, simply queen takes c4, defending c3, and white should be fine. Okay, so after the move d takes c4, the move e4 is very aggressive, and after e4, black needs to play energetically. c5, d5, b5, not possible to take that pawn, e5. And we have a very aggressive game where the black king is going to be stuck on f8, the white king is going to stay in the center for a while. So if you want to play the Petrosian system tactically with white, e4 is the move. If you want to play a slightly safer position, then e3 is the best option. After e3 you are putting pressure on the c4 pawn. Black continues with the move bishop e6. Defending the pawn now, of course, d5 is not possible because it's defended 3 times. If black wishes to give up his bishop, then d5 is still not possible because bishop takes, pawn takes, and queen takes. So this still doesn't work. Black would be 2 pawns up in this case. So after the move bishop e6, now we have a fairly complicated line, which is tactical. Okay, knight e5, putting extra pressure on the c4 pawn, trying to simply take the pawn. Knight d5, allowing white to capture but threatening to take on c3. And now we have knight c4, c5 trying to break open the center, white checks with queen a4 check, and knight c6. And this is, well, there's a lot of piece tension in the center, but it's likely going to end in a passive position which is very peaceful. Knight e5, double attacking c6, and now black has to castle. Knight takes c6, b takes c6, and now white doesn't take, because if white takes on c6, then I think simply c takes d is going to be sufficient and black is going to be better, putting pressure on c3. So bishop e2 trying to develop, and now c takes d, e takes d. You can take, but I don't think that should be the best option. I think c5 should be the best option, trying to open up the center, and c5 threatens to win an exchange. Let me just see what the engine says. The engines want... Oh, okay. I guess I have to give him a bit of time. Wait. Okay. Let's go back. Where did we go wrong? Okay, so e3, bishop e6. Knight e5, knight d5. Knight takes c4, c5. Now queen a4 check is a mistake apparently, and that's theoretically the most commonly played move. I'm wondering why it's a mistake. Knight c6, knight e5. Castles, knight takes c6, b takes c6. And now bishop to e2 is a bad move. Okay, let's find an alternative for queen a4. Instead of queen a4 then, knight b5 has only been played 9 times. Knight e4 has been played 9 times, and rook c1 has also been played. Let's go with knight b5. And after castles, e4 now. Yeah, this does seem better, but black should still be much better here. So what's wrong? Okay, e3, bishop e6. Knight e5 is theory. Knight d5 is mainline theory. Knight takes c4 is the main move. c5 is the main move. Is it possible that black is so much better here? I would like your advice on this, because I have been studying this variation from a theoretical perspective, and I'm not sure why this should be so much better. Apparently black has managed to break through the center. So let's go over that once again. I'm sorry this is going to take a bit longer now. So we have to figure out what white is doing wrong, and its theory. Knight e5. It's probably the fact that my PC is really slow, so using the engine doesn't work unless I let it work for a long time. I'm going to try once again. Okay, knight e5 is a mistake, but it's the main move. If bishop e2 and castles, white should be slightly better. So perhaps bishop e2 is the way, but why are all the grandmasters playing knight e5 if it's bad? Knight d5, knight c4, c5. I'm really confused about this. Okay, the highest winning percentage for white came after the move knight b5. Castles. And now white seems to be doing fine with the move e4. And this, oh, this is why the engine doesn't like the variation, because cd is possible. And what if pawn takes knight? Ah, okay, queen a5 check. And 2 knights are hanging. Okay, this is really complicated. Okay, e4. Let's see. This is the theoretical move, knight f6. And now all of a sudden, white is much better. Okay, excuse my slow PC and my bad engine. I'm going to try to figure that out. Okay, so e3, bishop e6, knight e5, knight e5, knight c4, c5 is correct. And now knight b5. Okay, I'm sorry about that. Knight b5 should be played. And after castles, e4. Now the problem is that black has this very tricky c takes d4. And after c takes d4, if white takes the knight, then queen takes knight. The bishop is hanging, the b5 knight is hanging. Okay. So after c takes d4, white shouldn't take the knight, white should take the pawn. And now after bishop takes, queen takes, the knight has to move now. Okay, no, a tempo on the queen first. The queen moves back and knight b4. Well, the material here is equal. Both sides have 6 pawns. White has the bishop pair, but black has managed to break through the center. So I don't see why black should be better at all. He has given up his Grunfeld bishop. But okay, white is still 2 moves away from castling. Yeah, okay, this position is complicated. Be careful with pawn to e3 as white. I guess that's the reason why e4 is more popular. So, let's go over that once again. Bishop g7, bishop g5, the Petrosian system. If black plays dc4, play e4. e3 is complicated and, according to my engine, should be better for black, or at least too tricky for white. If you play perfectly with white, then you might be fine, but still play e4. So once again, after dc, play e4. Black should play c5, d5, b5, e5. This is the variation that you want to play. And in these lines, white should be slightly better. And this is why I don't like the move dc. Because after d takes c4, this position, even though black is a pawn up, seems much easier to play for white. White has this huge center and these two very aggressive central pawns. Okay, now let's look at the main move, knight e4. Knight e4 tries to chase the bishop away. Now, white can react in 3 different ways. Well, 2 different ways, but one way is 2 moves. White can either ignore that and give up the bishop with c takes d5, which is the main move, or he can retreat the bishop. The bishop can go either to f4 or to h4. h4 is a more popular move, and now knight takes c3, b takes c3, d takes c4, and black can now regain the pawn with queen a4, queen d7, queen takes c4, and you can see that both sides have 7 pawns, so the material is equal. Black is going to be faster to castle, and I think I would rather have black here, because white has an isolated pawn on a2, white has hanging pawns, or still not hanging pawns, on d4 and c3. If he plays e3 and solidifies the structure, they're going to be more defended. And black has this option of playing knight c6, knight a5 to knight c4, trying to gain control over the c4 square, which is one of the main weaknesses in the Grunfeld. Now black should continue with the move b6, and the point of the move b6 is not bishop b7, the point is bishop a6, and you're going to force the white king to recapture on f1, or the rook, because if white doesn't continue with e3 solidifying his pawn chain is going to be weaker. If he plays g3 and e3, then he's going to have a lot of dark squared weaknesses, and also g3 runs into h6, g5, trapping the dark squared bishop. So white has to play the move e3. If he tries moving the queen, then still bishop a6 stops e3. So once e3 is played, bishop takes, king takes. After b6, e3 is the main move, bishop a6, queen moves to b3, takes, king takes, castles. And now white has this huge center. It's not going to be easy to break it open, but he is unable to castle, and he is yet to develop his rook. So white should continue with the move king e2, trying to get his rook into the game, c5, trying to break open the center, and now rook h to d1, c d4, knight c6. Rook AC1, knight A5, gaining a tempo on the queen. And here, according to the engines, this should be equal, according to theory as well. You can see that this pawn structure is thematic for the Grunfeld. White has the e-pawn and the d-pawn. They are not on e4 and d5, but they could be. And black has a 2-to-1 pawn majority on the queen side, which can be utilized easily, much easier than white's pawn majority. So trading pieces should favor black here, in my opinion. Any piece trades will make it much easier to push these pawns through, and the black king is closer to stopping white's pawn majority. So that's the move bishop h4. Instead of bishop h4 after knight e4, white could also play the move bishop f4, which should be slightly better. I think the bishop is better on this diagonal than on this diagonal. And also, perhaps g3 is an option, because now the bishop can retreat back, but still it shouldn't be a good option. So now knight takes c3 once again, b takes c3, c5, black plays the same things he was playing before against bishop h4, bishop e3, trying to develop his f1 bishop, castles, cd5, queen d5, bishop e2 trying to castle, and now cd4, cd4, knight c6. Once again, we have the same pawn structure. The difference is that the bishop is on f4 and not on h4. Perhaps in some positions this has allowed the black queen to move, because otherwise the e7 pawn would have been hanging. And I think this is once again equal, both according to the engines and according to theory, and you have the same plans with black. You want to push your queenside pawn majority, trade off the pieces, if possible put pressure on the a2 pawn. Okay, and the main move after knight e4 is giving the bishop up, giving up the bishop pair with c takes d5. Now, after c takes d5, black has to follow up a with b. It doesn't make any sense to play knight e4 and then not take the bishop. So knight takes g5, knight takes g5, and now the only move in this position, which gives black a slight advantage, and this is why I think that Petrosian system shouldn't really be played by white. I think this is easier to play for black, especially because you have this great bishop which now has no opposition. So white has basically traded off the counterpart of the Grunfeld bishop. So in theory, this should be hard to play for white. Although it's hard, black still has to prove that. So now e6, not of course taking on e6 is not possible. E d6, fe6, or bishop e6, knight e6, fe6 is not possible, because the knight is hanging. So white needs to either retreat the knight or defend the knight. Retreating the knight is slightly less common. Something like e5, e3 castles happens. And in these positions, the pawn structure is going to resemble a queen's gambit declined, with one of the main plans for white being the minority attack. If he wants to play positionally, if he wants to play aggressively, then he can go for queenside castling. But if, let's say, the pawn structure is with c6, which is probably going to happen, let's say bishop e2, c6, then white could go for a3, b4, b5, trying to weaken the c6 square and get his knight from a4 into c5, so for the minority attack. And after e6, the main move is queen d2, defending the knight instead of retreating it. And now we have the move e d5 once again. Queen e3 check is the difference, because now that's a more favorable move. King f8. Once again, trading queens would allow knight takes pawn, and then c7 would be weak, and you would have to play king d8. So king f8 is the only move here. Now queen f4, threatening to checkmate on f7. Bishop f6, attacking the knight and saving black from checkmate, and now h4. And this is the most aggressive and the best way for white to play, putting kingside pressure on the black position. You can still go for a positional game with e3, bishop e2 castles. Black is going to play c6, you can play a3, b4. But if you play h4 and these variations with queen e3, queen f4, now you are basically committed to an attack. h6, chasing the knight away, knight f3, and now king to g7, opening up his rook. And here white castles. And this is what the Petrosian system is about. In my opinion, if white plays the Petrosian system, then he probably wants to play this. This is very aggressive, and it's not likely that the game is going to end in a draw. even on Grandmaster level. This is very aggressive and there are going to be a lot of chances for both sides. From this position, about 50 games have been played. White scores a bit worse than black. Black wins a slightly bigger percentage of the games, and that's because black's king, despite the pawn avalanche, is slightly safer. Bishop e6, e3, trying to open up his bishop, knight d7, bishop d3, c6, solidifying his d5 pawn, and now g4. And you can see that white is going for an attack. There's no other way to put that. White wants to checkmate. And if black plays carefully, in theory he should be slightly better. If he misplays the position, white is going to checkmate. So queen b8 is the best move I would advise, because the black queen wants to trade itself, black has the bishop pair, black has a safer pawn structure, and black hasn't committed himself with a couple of pawn moves towards the white king yet. So trading of the queens would benefit black here. Rook d to g1, taking here would allow an extra pawn to come towards the center. It would be too dangerous. So now we play bishop e7, and now white is forced to trade the queens off. If bishop d6, then black loses the queen. So now queen takes b8, rook a takes b8, knight e2 or something else, and white is still going to try to attack, but of course the attack is not going to be as potent because the queens are off the board, and black can now look forward to his own pawn pushes, something like b5 or b6, c5, trying to gain more space on the queen side. White is going to play on the king side, black is going to play on the queen side. Checkmate is not as likely because the queens are no longer on the board, and I would give a slight edge to black. He has the bishop pair. Even though the position is closed and the light squared bishop on e6 is not that good, white only has the light squared bishop, so he doesn't have so many squares to roam around on because all of black's pawns are on light squares. So this bishop is going to be what makes the difference in the position, in my opinion. Okay, sorry once again about the e3 lines after dc4. I got a bit confused and my engine got a bit confused. I would advise that to dc4 players with white played the move e4. It's more aggressive and better. And for black, I would advise you to fight the Petrosian system with the main line, knight e4. And whatever black plays, if he goes for cd4, black should be better. You just need to learn the attacking patterns white has on the queen side. And bishop h4 and bishop f4 are slightly inferior to cd4 in my opinion. Okay, let me know what you think. I hope you liked the Petrosian system. I know it's a lot of theory and that it's complicated. I hope that you managed to learn something. If you would like extra material, I'm going to post 5 tasks on the Patreon feed and an in-depth look in the video. So if you want to reinforce your knowledge and solve some practical exercises, head over to Patreon. You can find the link in the description below. Thanks very much for watching and stay tuned for more chess. Bye bye. Hi everyone, Stepan here. Today I'm going to finish the series on the Grunfeld defense with the Neo Grunfeld, which is the most uncommon way for white to fight the Grunfeld defense. The Neo Grunfeld, first of all, is an extremely transpositional opening. You could use several different moves order to enter it. You could transpose to different openings after you have entered it. So if you choose to play the Neo Grunfeld, it's way more important to know the plans and ideas than to know the exact move orders. You have to know the patterns, the piece placement, attacking plans, defensive plans, main weaknesses, main pawn breaks, main pawn pushes, the positioning of the kings, the positioning of the knights. So it's way more important to understand where your pieces go and to understand what the ideas in the opening is than to know the exact move orders, because it's highly likely, as opposed to some other lines such as the Russian system that we've looked at yesterday, it's highly likely that you are going to be out of your prep really soon. So the Neo Grunfeld is an opening which is played on the highest level, and those guys know everything, but I would say that below Grandmaster level, when people play the Neo Grunfeld, they often enter positions that they understand as opposed to positions that they know exactly, and they know, okay, this is the correct move, this is the theoretical move, this is the engine move. So that's the first thing. And I think that that's why I'm not going to be looking at lines of 20 or 30 moves deep or deep variations with exact move orders. I'm going to try to give you plans, ideas for both sides, piece placement, patterns and stuff like that. So we are going to be focusing on that because the Neo Grunfeld is not a variation, it's a setup for white. Now, the Neo Grunfeld can be entered via 2 different move orders. Sorry about this. So d4, knight f6, c4, g6, g3 for white. This move signifies that white, if black plays the Grunfeld defense, is going to play the neo-Grunfeld. The problem is, black can still choose to play the Fianchetto King's Indian. If you haven't seen my video on the Fianchetto King's Indian, see it. This is the Fianchetto variation of the King's Indian defense if black chooses to enter that. So let me just show you how. If black plays bishop g7 here, bishop g2, bishop g7, bishop g2, black can now castle, and white can play the move knight c3, and we are now in the Fianchetto King's Indian, and you basically have to know that if you're going to play the neo-Grunfeld. So you can't expect to be playing the Grunfeld defense 100% of the time if you play the move g3 on move 3. Okay, so after d4, knight f6, c4, g6, we can have g3, and d5 immediately by black, which is now the neo-Grunfeld defense. But black can also choose to play after g3 the move bishop g7, as I said, not giving away whether it's going to be the King's Indian or the neo-Grunfeld. And after bishop g2, as I said, if he castles, he's going to play the King's Indian, although he could castle and then play d5 if white allows it. But he could also play d5 immediately, and this is now, once again, the neo-Grunfeld defense via a different move order. The positions are going to transpose. The only difference is the fianchettoed bishops, and both sides can choose to enter the neo-Grunfeld via a different move order. Okay, now, as I said, it's a setup, not a variation. What's it characterized by? The first thing, which you can see here, the main thing in the neo-Grunfeld is that white is fianchettoing his f1 bishop to g2. That's the huge difference. The bishop, I'm just going to show you one example of variation. This is the Hungarian variation in the Russian system, one of the main lines in the Russian system, where the bishop goes to e2. We have achieved this by d5, knight f3, bishop g7, queen b3, the Russian, dc4, queen c4 castles, e4, a6, bishop e2. And now this bishop is on e2. It's a defensive piece. That's very important to highlight. It's quite different to the bishop on g7. This bishop is defending. It has this diagonal d3, c4, b5, a6, or f3, g4, h5. And it can help in a kingside pawn storm, of course, as it usually does. Or it could come to the c4 square and put pressure on f7, and it also reinforces the c4 square because the black knight, often in the Grunfeld, is going to want to enter that. Now, in the neo-Grunfeld, this bishop is a counterpart to black's bishop. It's similar to the bishop on g7, and what's it doing? It's reinforcing the main square in this position. If you think about the Grunfeld defense, the main square in the Grunfeld is d5. And most of the fighting is going to revolve around the d5 square. So this bishop does a great job at supporting d5 and putting pressure on black's queen side. Now, in the normal Grunfeld, black is used to having to blow up the center and then putting pressure on white's queen side. That's his main idea. Now that the white bishop is on g2, white is sort of trying to copy black's ideas, but with a huge difference that his central pawns are more advanced and he basically has more control in the center, as we are going to see. So white has the same trumps black has, but he has more central control. And we're going to be looking at two different ways to play this. Well, three different ways, but two main branchings of the variation. In this position, or in the other move order that we were looking at, so d4, knight f6, c4, g6, g3, bishop g7, bishop g2, d5. Now we have the exact same position. White can choose to do two things. Firstly, he could. Sorry about this. Firstly, he could take the pawn. Or he can delay taking the pawn, or he cannot take it at all. He doesn't have to take it at all. And that will make a huge difference. So one of the main themes in the neo-Grunfeld is who is going to capture whose pawn. Is white going to capture on d5, or is black going to capture on c4? Now, the positions in which white captures on d5 can be divided into two thematic sections. One of them is where white follows the capture with e4. The other one is where white follows the capture with e3. Now you can guess probably positions with e4 are way more dynamic, and they often lead to an isolated queen's pawn. And positions with e3 are more solid. White is going to have this pawn structure with weak light squares, but this defender is going to be crucial in keeping that safe. And if black is allowed to capture, white is going to recapture that pawn later on in the game, and the positions are going to resemble the lines with e3, where white has this solid pawn structure. Now, let's look at the exchange variation first, where white captures the pawn on d5. So d5. And the most common way to play this is to take before the bishops get developed. Once again, you could take when the bishops get developed. It's transpositional. So c takes d5. Black has to recapture. He's going to recapture with the knight. Now we have this inserted bishop fianchetto, and we have the same position. And after bishop g2, bishop g7, white now chooses between two moves. The first move is e4, as I said, the most aggressive move. The second move is knight f3. I want to look at that first. Knight f3 delays chasing this knight away and leaves the option of playing the move e3. And if e3 setups are played, the knight never goes to f3. So if you are playing black in this position, if white plays the move knight f3, he's not going to play the move e4. The knight is much better on e2, reinforcing d4 and keeping this bishop open. It's crucial to put the knight on e2 if you play e4. So after knight f3, black can castle or play the move knight b6, they transpose, knight b6, knight c3, knight c6. Black has these Grunfeld / Alekhine defense knights on b6 and c6. And now pawn to e3. And white has created his solid pawn structure. And one thing I would like to highlight here, and this is visually very clear. Look at this pawn structure. All of white's pawns are on dark squares. That means if you pause the video and try to figure out which bishop is better for each side, you are going to quickly see that white's light square bishop on g2 and black's dark squared bishop on light squared bishop on c8 are much better than the c1 bishop and the g7 bishop. That's clear. The g7 bishop has way less scope than the g2 bishop because the light squares are unoccupied in this position and the dark squares are very well defended. So if you could choose a position in the Grunfeld in which your queenside bishop is worse than your kingside bishop, which is fianchettoed on g2, then that would be ideal. You want your g2 bishop to be more active than your c1 bishop. So that's just theoretical. It's not an advantage. It's just an advantage in theory. Okay, both sides castle. We have rook e8, rook e1, normal development, and now a5. Black starts his queenside expansion. Something like queen e2, bishop e6, knight d2. And now you have a normal queen's pawn position, which couldn't be any simpler, in my opinion. This is something you need to recognize as a setup. This is something that you need to play as a setup. You have two pawns on the queen side. That means you are going to be weaker on the queen side if you get rid of your d4 pawn. That's the first thing. So black is going to have a 3-2 pawn advantage. You have light squared weaknesses around your king because all of your pawns are on dark squares. So under no circumstances do you want to trade off your g2 bishop. If something like queen d7 happens, trying to trade off your bishop, it might be best to just retreat it to h1 and to keep it. Thirdly, you have pressure on the queen side. The c6 knight is locked for the moment. Fourthly, you have a weakness on c4 and on d5, which for the moment have to be protected by a piece. If you try to defend it with b3, then all of a sudden this diagonal becomes much weaker. And you're going to play a normal position. It's no advantage for white. In theory, you are slightly better because your fianchettoed bishop is slightly better, but it's nothing major. And this is a calm, passive variation which you could choose, a calm setup you could choose, and it gives a little bit more than equality to white. So that's the move knight f3. And after bishop g7, a way more aggressive move, and the main line is not following up with knight f3, e3, but playing the move e4. And this is the critical line. This is the way to challenge black in the neo-Grunfeld. Now, there are two moves here. The main move is knight b6. The sideline is knight b4. Knight b4, well, I don't like knight b4, I have to say. Knight b4, the main move here is d5. If you try I'm going to turn on the engine for this so that you can see the evaluation. If you try this check with queen a4 check, it's absolutely horrendous because knight c6. If you try d5 now, your diagonal is weak. You are marching into knight d3 check, and after the king moves, well, everything is unpre. You are going to win c6, but it's not going to be that easy to play. So after knight b4, as white, don't think that this is a blunder. It's not a blunder. Don't play queen a4 check. And players with black might play knight b4 just to confuse you. Okay, continue with the most principled variation, d5. Now, you might be threatening queen a4, so black has to react. Now it's a whole different thing because you are one tempo up in the variation. So c6, stopping the check, as simple as that. a3 chasing the knight away, and now what black was banking on, the move queen a5. And here you can see that the line with knight b4 is critical, very aggressive. You have to know everything, and it's not easy to play. If you allow this check, you're going to lose the game because it's a double check by the queen and by the knight. So you have to react. Knight c3, defending both. And now cd5, bishop f4, knight 4 to c6, allowing the recapture of the pawn, ed5, knight d4, and now we get madness on the board. This knight is loose on d4, that's the simplest way to put it. If black is uncareful, it could be captured. It's really, you have to play precise engine moves to survive this, or you have to know tons of theory. Knight f3, bishop g4, both sides castle, rook e1, queen b6, defending the knight now for the second time, rook b1, e6, undermining the center. You can see that there is a lot of tension, you can see that it's very tricky. I would advise players with black to play the move knight b4 if they are playing a much lower rated opponent whom they think they can beat quickly, who isn't going to know what to do against this, who is probably going to play something like queen a4 check, or b, if you're playing somebody much higher rated who might not be as versed in the theory with knight b4 as you are, if you are playing somebody equal, play the move knight b6. That would be my advice. It's just better. Okay, now let's continue the development. Knight e2, the normal developing square for the knight. You don't want to kill off your bishop. c5, black has to start undermining the center. Once again, I'm going to turn on the engine for this just so that you can see the mistake. If you take on c5, queen takes, king takes, and you have basically weakened your diagonal terminally. It's going to be really hard to develop. It's going to be hard to move your knights. You're losing the pawn back anyway, and black is simply better. So if you open up this bishop for nothing in compensation, that's bad news. So bishop e2, c5, you always continue with d5. The bishop is open, that is true, but you have this strong pawn chain, which is going to have to be undermined by black, and black for the moment doesn't have the c6 square for his knight. Okay, so it's much better to play the move d5. And black should waste no time here. e6 immediately, trying to put pressure on the position. Both sides castle. Although it is possible for black to take on d5 immediately, but they transpose. And now we get this position with knight ec3. The difference is you play your e knight to c3, you don't play your b knight to c3, because you have to be able to meet knight c4 with knight d2. That's one important point. So after castles, this might seem way more natural, but then after something like knight c4 in the future, you don't have a piece to challenge the knight with. That's why after castles, you play knight e to c3, defending your center, defending the diagonal, and if knight c4, you are able to play knight d2. Okay, and this is going to happen in the future in the variation. So knight ec3, knight a6, no better square to develop the knight to, defending the c5 pawn, threatening to come into b4 in some variations, threatening to return this way if some exchanges happen. Now a4, trying to undermine the knight and trying to put pressure on black's queen side, and now we get e takes d5, e takes d5. And one thing I would like to point out, if you play the move e4 in the exchange variation, which is much more aggressive and much more principled, you have to know this setup, and middle game wise, you need to be comfortable with playing an IQP position on the 5th rank. And usually isolated queen pawns are on the 4th rank, And you are going to have blockades on the d5 square. You are going to have your bishop on this diagonal, putting pressure on f7, and there are going to be more attacking plans. This isolated queen's pawn position doesn't have that many attacking plans, and that's why I think it's uncommon and harder to play than the normal IQP you would get from other queen's pawn openings. Okay, knight c4, knight d2. That's why you played your e knight to c3. Black has to exchange, but his b6 knight was worse than your knight on b1, so why not? Knight takes d2, bishop takes d2 developing, bishop f5, a very aggressive diagonal for the bishop, bishop e3, putting pressure on c5, something like queen d7. And now this is where I would like to stop, because further you are only going to get theoretical lines which are going to be nearly impossible to remember. If you want to play the Neo Grunfeld with e4, this is the position you have to think about. One thing that's clear, white has a weak pawn on d5. If you trade the pieces off, that pawn is going to become even weaker. So any piece trades are going to be benefiting black. Secondly, black has a potential or a real queenside pawn majority, which means that he has a potential passed pawn. Probably on the c file or on the b file, probably on the c file. So if the pieces get traded off, the black king is fast enough to stop your d5 pawn, and then he is just going to play the move b5, and it's not going to be easy to stop these pawns. So you have to use your time and your moves wisely in this position. I myself don't like dynamic positions. I don't like isolated queen's pawn positions. I don't like positions in which I have to do something quickly and my opponent can just wait, trade off the pieces and have a better ending. So I don't like the Neo Grunfeld for that reason, or I don't like the e4 variation for that reason. But if you are prepared to play dynamically here, then by all means do so, play this isolated queen's pawn position. I would just like to mention that there have been 10 games from this position. Black has only won 3 games, white has won 5 games, and 2 games have ended in a draw. So white scores a bit better in master games, but still it should be pretty equal according to the engines. But as I said, these positions are, in my opinion, harder to play for white. Okay, and now let's look at white's second option. We were just looking at the move c takes d, leading to either e3 or e4 positions. Now let's look at white leaving black the option to capture the pawn. So not taking on d5, allowing black to capture on c4. And as I said, these positions are going to resemble e3 positions, because the pawn is going to go to e3. But the difference is, as white, you have to do something to recapture this pawn, you have to do something to either compensate for the pawn, or you have to waste time to take it. So in my opinion, and this is purely subjective, it's just simpler to take on d5 and then play e3 than to allow what I'm about to show you. Firstly, black doesn't have to take here. Black can have 2 different setups here. One of them is with taking and castles, the other one is with playing c6. This I wouldn't recommend for black. c6 goes for a sort of Slav position with a fianchetto, where you're simply reinforcing your d5 weakness. White should now take cd5, knight c3 castles, knight e5, e6, and you have this sort of London system knight on e5. You have this strong pawn chain with probably e3 and d4, and you basically have no problems in the position. And black's position is symmetrical, but he is behind because when white castles, knight f to d7 has to happen, and now it's sort of equal. The development is equal. The only difference is that the knight is on c3, the other knight is on d7, white's knight is on e5, black's knight is on f6. So symmetrical, boring. If you want to play this with black, you are always going to be slightly worse, and you are not going to have any chances to win. So after the move knight f3, the setup with c6 is not what I would recommend. I would recommend dc4, challenging white in his plan. And now white recaptures the pawn, or tries to recapture the pawn, with knight a3. He doesn't develop to c3 but to a3 to put pressure on this pawn. And black shouldn't really allow this capture. The best way to liquidate his pawn is with the move c3 and going for b takes c3, arguing that this pawn is weaker than the pawn on b2, which is true, which makes the diagonal weaker, which means that any c5 break is going to be much harder to meet. Now this resembles the exchange Grunfeld, where the pawns are on e4, d4 and b3 and c3, in which the diagonal gets quite weak. So now we sort of have an exchange Grunfeld in which white's bishop is on g2 and the knight is for some reason on a3. Okay, so the plans for black are going to be simple. Put pressure on the diagonal. Castles, castles, immediate c5. And now, since white didn't play e4 yet, that's a huge advantage. In the exchange Grunfeld, you play e4, and then the knight from d5 takes on c3, you recapture with the b pawn, so you no longer have a chance to protect your d4 pawn. Here, e4 would be a stupid move because you would enter a bad exchange Grunfeld, so e3. Knight c6 developing, queen e2, developing the queen, bishop f5, rook d1, queen b6, normal developing moves. White has the square c4. White can put his bishop on b2, challenge the diagonal. White can put the rook on b1. And it's once again going to be a setup rather than a variation, a setup that you have to know. One thing I would like to point out once again, you don't want to trade off your light squared bishop as white, and as black, it would be less harmful to trade off your dark squared bishop because your pawn is still on e7, so you have less weaknesses. Obviously, this bishop is great, this bishop is great, this bishop is bad, this bishop is bad for the moment because of the pawn structure. The worst piece on the board, I would say, is the c1 bishop, but as soon as white plays bishop b2, you can see that white, if allowed, well, let's give white two moves. Let's say black does nothing. Rook b8. Here, let's say he moves the knight, doesn't lose the knight. And now c4. And after c4, this pawn chain is really strong. There might be some tactical possibilities. I'm not saying this is correct. I'm just saying this is an idea. If you can do this and reinforce your pawns, later follow it up with e4, e5, you would be strategically winning. Okay, so bishop b2, putting the bishop on the long diagonal. This is something Garry Kasparov used to do in his games, where there were still two pawns on the diagonal. He would still fianchetto his bishop and use it later on with great success. Rook fd8, knight c4, using the weakness, queen a6, bishop f1, defending the knight for the second time. Now he's able to move it, rook ac8. Both sides are going to be playing normal chess. I would rather have white because I think my pieces are better, but it should be equal according to theory. So that's the third setup I wanted to mention. So remember that if you play the Neo Grunfeld, it's a setup, not a variation. You need to know the plans, not the exact move orders. As white, you choose between three setups: playing knight f3 firstly, and allowing black to exchange on c4, which leads to these positions. Exchanging on d5 and following up with e4, which leads to isolated queen's pawn positions, and exchanging on d5 and following it up with e3, which leads to light square weaknesses and a simple equal position. Okay, that's it for the theory. I didn't manage to arrange a training game in the Neo Grunfeld, unfortunately, so today I'm going to be playing just a normal training game. I have arranged several training games, all of them in the Semi-Slav and one in the Nimzo-Indian, in the F3 Nimzo-Indian. Tomorrow I will be starting the series on the Nimzo-Indian, and I still don't have anybody to play for the introductory video, which can be any Nimzo-Indian, just starting from the Nimzo. So if you would like to play me in the Nimzo-Indian tomorrow, follow the link at the beginning of the description. I appreciate the support and I hope we can arrange the training game. Thank you very much for watching. Let me know what you think and stay tuned for more chess. Bye bye. Hi everyone, Stepan here. In today's video I'm going to continue the series on the Grunfeld defense. And today we are going to be looking at the Brinkman attack, which is, it's not considered to be an anti-Grunfeld per se, I think, but it sort of goes against black's plans in the Grunfeld and tries to avoid the main lines, tries to avoid the open center, imbalanced aggressive games, and sort of is white asking for a calmer game than what a normal Grunfeld should be. So after d4, knight f6, c4, g6, knight c3, d5, the Grunfeld defense, White now plays the move bishop to f4. Bishop f4 is the Brinkman attack. So instead of going for the exchange variation with c takes d5, instead of queen b3, which is the Russian, which we are going to cover, White chooses a slightly uncommon continuation, much rarer than the main lines and quite different to the main lines. If you haven't seen the introduction to the Grunfeld defense, I have made an introductory video. You can find it on the channel. I would advise you to look at it to make sure you understand the basic ideas behind the opening. Because the Brinkman attack is quite different to the normal Grunfelds. So, the reason why White plays bishop f4 here is is because of simple development. White doesn't want to expand in the center with e4, which happens after d5 and the exchange variation, for example, takes, e4, knight takes, b takes. You can see that White has now advanced his e pawn to e4, and now his c1 bishop still has an open diagonal to develop to. In the Brinkman attack after bishop f4, the move bishop f4 signifies that White wants to close the position down with the move e3 and play sort of a more normal, calmer queen's pawn opening, not the Grunfeld defense open center chaotic play. Okay, and Black has several ways to respond to the Brinkman attack. One move which Black has to play before going on any farther is the move bishop g7. And this is the response you are always going to play to bishop f4 and to most other Grunfeld variations White can choose. So bishop g7 is your move. And now White has one more logical move he has to play, e3. So White has developed his bishop to f4 and opened the position up for his light-squared bishop on f1. His next few moves, if Black does nothing, are going to be either bishop d3 or bishop e2, either knight f3 or knight e2, and castling. And White is going to have a safe position. Now, the Brinkman attack can transpose to a lot of different openings. This can occur from the semi-Slav and Slav positions if the game now continues e6, c6, and for some reason Black chooses to play g6, bishop g7. This can be several different openings, and it can still transpose to the reti, it can still transpose to the sort of what Black does against the King's Indian attack in some variations. After c5, it can resemble some lines in the Tarrasch and the semi-Tarrasch. So this, the Brinkman attack, is one variation of the Grunfeld which is hugely transpositional, and it can end up being a lot of different things if one of the two players is not acquainted with the theory well. And now Black has three approaches to this position. I would like you to consider which one you choose very carefully, because all three are very different. Firstly, let's go over the third most common move. Apart from these three moves, so castles, c5 and c6, on move 5, Black doesn't really have another good option. Let's look at c6 first. c6 is the least common move, and it goes into what I said previously, sort of Slav fianchetto positions, which can happen and can transpose and can occur from other openings, and it's the safest way for Black to play. I would say it is the least challenging, and it doesn't pose as much trouble to White as the other two moves, but it's solid, and if you are familiar with the Slav and semi-Slav structures, this might be the way for you to play. Now White, as I said, continues developing, Black castles, and now White can either develop his bishop or play the move h3, which will safeguard his bishop in case of any knight h5 or perhaps bishop h4 stopping the spin. So bishop e2 is one move, after which Black should play dc4. This is the common trick to force White to waste the tempo. When the f1 bishop is developed in queenside, in queen's pawn openings where there's a tension between c4 and d5, Black is best advised to wait for this move bishop e2 or bishop e3 and only then capture, because then it's virtually a tempo on the bishop, because bishop has now wasted the move to develop to e2 and then one more to develop to recapture on c4. Knight bd7 castles. This is one way for White to play, and you can see that neither side has any apparent problems. In my opinion, these setups with c6, b7, a7 are much more comfortable for Black when the bishop is on e7, the pawn on e6, and the g6 pawn is still on g7, so we have a sort of Caro-Kann structure, but this is perfectly playable as well, and this is similar to many hyper-modern openings such as the Pirc, the Modern, or the King's Indian, and in fact a setup like this can occur from any of the three mentioned openings. After castles, though, the main move for White is h3, stopping knight h5, knight g4, and bishop g4. knight bd7. Now white captures cd5, knight d5, you want to trade the c3 knight, knight d5, cd5, bishop d3. And you can see that it's a slow game. Both sides first have to develop. White still has to castle. Queen a5 check is a probing move. Knight d2 blocking the check isn't that good. The best move for white is to actually go to an endgame. So after queen d2, queen takes d2, king takes d2. We now have a sort of almost endgame and a very peaceful position, which is unfortunately for the attacking player with white highly likely to end in a draw. So with the black pieces, if you want a calm maneuvering game, which I suppose you don't if you play the Grunfeld, when you face the Brinkmann attack after bishop g7, e3, if you are playing a much higher rated opponent or a much lower rated opponent and you want to suffocate him with positional play, I would recommend the move c6. That's definitely the slowest, the safest move, and if you want to risk the least, the best move. Okay, now let's look at the two other moves, which are way more complex and way more aggressive. Firstly, the second sideline, second most popular move, c5. This is what I would recommend for players with black. c5 is a very aggressive move. It tries to break open white's strong center. As you may remember from the introductory video, the whole point of the Grunfeld is to break white's center on the d4 point. So knight c6, sometimes queen b6, queen a5, bishop g4 stopping the knight from defending d4, and all of the pressure should be on the d4 pawn. Now, in most positions, in the queen's pawn openings, let's say this position occurs, there is a possibility for black to have an isolated queen's pawn and for white to have an isolated queen's pawn. So after c5, since the e pawn is still here, that's not that likely to happen. So white should react with the move dc5, and after queen a5 going for the recapture of the pawn, white should continue with the move rook c1. Now dc4, black captures the pawn, bishop takes c4. Now if you count the material, white has 7 pawns, black has 6 pawns, but in a while black is going to take back the c5 pawn, and it's not a gambit because there is the Grunfeld gambit, which we are going to look at in about 5 minutes, which also revolves around the pawn sacrifice for black. So after bishop takes c4, you can now see that black still has to develop his queen side, it's underdeveloped. White still has to develop his knight and castle his king. So this move is kind of provocative because it allows white to gain lead in development. That's not something that happens very often in the Grunfeld. And usually black is going to be the first one to castle. Okay, castles for black, knight f3 for white, and now queen takes c5. After queen takes c5, the bishop is threatened. You can already see this X-ray on the queen, which can be uncomfortable. So bishop b3, and now black doesn't have to move the queen away immediately, even though that's possible. A move such as queen a5, black plays knight c6, white castles, and now queen a5. And c5 is a more aggressive move than c6, but it results in middle games and end games with a symmetrical pawn structure. By the way, I'm outside again and the crickets just became really loud, so sorry about that if you mind the sounds of the nature. Okay, queen a5, and now you can see the main feature of the position. The only imbalance is the fact that black has the g7 pawn on g6 and white has the e2 pawn on e6. If the situation was reversed, move this pawn back, move this pawn forward, the situation is identical. Even so, there is a 4-to-2 pawn structure on the king side, a 2-to-2 pawn structure on the queen side, which means that it's highly unlikely for either side to create a passed pawn. That means that any piece trades are going to make a peaceful result or a draw highly likely. So if you trade off the pieces, this ending 4-to-4, 2-to-2 is impossible to win. You can be the best player in the world, you cannot create a passed pawn here. There's no way. So if you are looking for the most aggressive way to play against the Brinkmann attack, c5, if played correctly by white and by black, could lead to a symmetrical pawn structure, which means that a win is not too probable. Let me continue the variation. One good news about this line with c5 is that it can become very aggressive if both players know a lot of theory. So let me show you the forcing lines. And this has all been played more than 400 times, so this is high-level theory, and it goes for more than 25 moves. So if you want to get a more advanced look into the c5 line of the Brinkman, keep watching. If not, rewind a bit and look at the last move. Okay, h3. White continues with h3. Now we have bishop f5, developing the bishop to the most active square and stopping the move e4 in many variations. Queen e2, reinforcing e4, knight e4, stopping e4. And now it's inadvisable to trade on e4 because this bishop would be really strong. A much better move is knight d5. After knight d5, things now get tricky. If you don't know this position with black, you might misplay it and white is going to have a simple advantage, because if you look at it now, the only weakness in black's position is the b2 square. In white's position is the b2 square or the b2 pawn, which the bishop is staring at, but the e2 queen is defending it. But I would say that these white pieces have a lot more prospects of creating trouble on the board than the black pieces. And the move knight d5 has a very clear idea in mind. In some variations, as we are going to see, white is going to sacrifice a rook on c6 for a huge initiative and a couple of pawns. Okay, we're going to look at that. So now, the only correct move for white, by far the best move, is e5. You want to chase the white pieces away as much as possible, as far away as possible, and you want to keep control of the center as much as possible. Now, you could argue that this pawn is overextended, and it is, but this bishop was too strong. Now, white has two ways to react. The most sensible way and the easiest way, and if you don't know it with white, the way that you are most probably going to choose, is bishop h2. Simply retreating the bishop back. Bishop e6, now attacking the knight twice. Rook f to d1 defending, rook f to d8 attacking the knight for the first time. And now you can see that this move e5, by chasing the bishop away, gaining a tempo and vacating the e6 square for the bishop, has created a lot of tension in the center, and black is now all of a sudden equally active. Queen c4 is the move here, defending the knight for one last time, but black has another piece coming into the attack, knight f6. Now if you count the attackers 1, 2, 3, 4, defenders 1, 2, 3, white needs to do something to defend, so e4 defending the knight. Now, rook a to c8, bringing his last piece into play, and this is why, if both players know the theory in c5 Brinkman attacks, this is going to be extremely interesting. And despite the fact that the pawn structure is symmetrical, there is so much piece tension in this position that it's very likely somebody is going to go wrong. This is extremely tactical. Now, the best move for white, knight g5, attacking the bishop, trying to remove the most aggressive piece black has. And the move here, believe it or not, is knight d4. You don't retreat the bishop, you play knight d4, since now the knight is no longer on f3, and you have basically removed one defender, you have activated your knight, and you're also threatening if the queen moves to win the exchange, and finally, you are attacking the queen. So this is a nasty discovered attack, which white needs to react to. And now, once again, if you are unfamiliar with the position with white, this is going to be hard to figure out. You are going to play a very tactical move here, knight e7 check. Well, you might think, I'm going to take on c8 and simply win the exchange. That's not the point. After, and this is good for black, by the way, the position is equal. Black didn't blunder. Knight e7 is theory. Black plays king f8. And now, white doesn't take on c8. That would in fact be a mistake, because bishop takes queen, of course. Instead of that, white takes on e6, knight takes e6 check. And now black still doesn't have time to take the queen, and the main reaction here, the best move here, isn't to recapture the knight with the pawn, because in that case knight takes c8 and white is winning. You take on e7, king takes e7, and now knight takes d8 is one move and the only move. Retreating the queen is losing. You are going to give your queen away for two rooks. So knight takes d8, rook takes c4, bishop takes c4, and in this position, taking the knight, which is of course loose and undefended, is a blunder, and white would win the game. If you take the knight, it doesn't matter with the king or with the queen. Take the knight, bishop takes e5, and you're going to lose. You're going to lose your knight back, and your knight is pinned to your queen or your king. So after bishop takes c4, you take knight takes e4, defending the e5 pawn, and now the position is considered to be equal. Each side has three minor pieces. Black has two knights and the bishop, white has two bishops and the knight. White has 2 rooks, black has a queen, white has 5 pawns, black has 6 pawns. Who is better? Well, I would prefer to have black here, to be honest. Of course, the knight isn't loose now. The position can continue here in only one way, and that's knight takes a7. You need to save your knight. Now it's still a bit tricky to save the position, but it's going to be fine because e5 is sort of loose, and you can survive this. So it's fairly tricky. Now it's equal material, and 2 bishops versus 2 knights in an open position. Well, let me tell you that in high-level games, 100% of the games from this position have ended in a draw, but on our level, or level up to 2000, 21, 2200, anything can happen here. The point is, this is 25 moves of theory. So after bishop f4, the Brinkman attack, bishop g7, e3, if you play c5 with black, prepare to have the final position that we just looked at after knight takes f7. This is theory that you have to know if you don't want to be worse. Now, let's look at the other option. We're looking at the position after bishop f5, queen e2, knight e4, knight e5, e5, chasing the bishop away. Now, white doesn't have to chase the bishop away. There's another option, as I said, of sacking the rook, sacking the exchange. So, you take on c6, and the point is, after bc6, you now have knight e7 check, king moves, knight takes c6, tempo on the queen, queen b6, knight c takes e5. If you count the material now, black has 4 pawns, white has 6 pawns, so white gave up the exchange for a minor piece and 2 pawns. Black has the bishop pair and the knight, white has 2 knights, 2 bishops, and the material is completely equal. Who is better here? Well, it depends on individual play. You already now have pressure on f7, so you sort of have to defend with bishop e6, bishop e6, queen e6, queen c2, f5. It's an aggressive, imbalanced position, so if you want to be a bit more ambitious with white, I would suggest that you go for this rook sacrifice. So remember that after e3, if you are prepared for tons of theory and an aggressive game against a stronger opponent, be prepared for a lot of theory, and for the positions with bishop h2 on move 15 or rook takes c6 on move 15. And if you are playing somebody inexperienced against the Grunfeld, you can expect him that after c5 he's not going to know that much theory, in which case this pawn structure, before e5, with 4 against 4 and 2 against 2 is going to lead to an equal position, so you better be prepared to spice things up. Okay, and finally the most popular move, and what is considered to be the main line against the Brinkman attack, is castles. And castles is a pawn sacrifice called the Grunfeld gambit. Now, there are 2 options here for white. One sideline is cd5 immediately, knight d5, queen d5, bishop c7, in which case it's going to be once again a fairly symmetrical pawn structure. After knight a6, bishop a6, queen g2, queen f3, knight f3, ba6, rook c1. Once again equal material. Black has doubled pawns on a7 and a6, and I would say that white is slightly better because of his pawn structure, but it's nothing major. Once again, most games end in a draw. So this is really not an ambitious way for white to play after castles. I would recommend the most active move, going for the Grunfeld gambit, or provoking black into the Grunfeld gambit, rook c1. Simply a much more active developing move, not resolving the tension in the center just yet. And now the gambit is c5, attacking the d4 pawn, which is unprotected, and allowing dc5. For the moment, white is a pawn up, and in some positions black is going to retake the pawn, in some positions white is going to remain a pawn up, hence the name of the opening. Now here black can either go for queen a5 immediately, after which cd5, knight e4, knight e2, knight a6, queen a4 is played. White forces a trade of queens and remains a pawn up. So this is a move I wouldn't recommend. You basically have to trade the queens here. Queen a4, knight b4. You're going to recapture one of the pawns, but in my opinion white is going to be better. Knight takes, bishop takes, rook takes, knight d5. If you look at the material here, white has 7 pawns, black has 6 pawns. I would say that this is a clear pawn up for white, and that white should be much better. So instead of that, after dc5, I would recommend the best move, bishop e6. This is the main move. So still for the moment, white is a pawn up. White has 8 pawns, black has 7. Knight f3 developing for white, knight c6 developing, bishop e2, knight e4, a very aggressive move. Now looking at the c5 pawn, trying to recapture, and most often trying to take on c3, trying to triple white's pawns and weaken his queenside even further. Castles, knight c3, bc3, and now dc4, taking the pawn back. Count the material now. Black has 7 pawns. White has 7 pawns, so black has regained his pawn, but it's going to be really hard to keep that pawn, because now white has the move knight g5, and you don't want to give up your bishop and double up your pawns. You cannot play the bishop to d5, that would be too loose in this position. Perhaps even the immediate e4 would be playable. So bishop d7, and now after bishop takes c4, you can see the point of the Grunfeld gambit. Black has given up a pawn. Black has 6 pawns, but a much healthier pawn structure and 3 actual targets in the position. The weakest point in white's position is the c3 pawn. c5 is also loose, a2 is also loose. A move like queen a5, attacking all 3 targets, can in some cases be enough to regain the pawn, but black will first want to finish his development and activate his pieces. Knight a5, exploiting, as we saw in the introductory video, the weak c4 square, which can no longer be defended by the pawn. Bishop d5, rook c8, queen d3 is the best move here, e6, chasing the bishop back, bishop f3, and now e5. Once again, black is going to try to activate his position, chase the white pieces back, and then try to target one of these 3 pawns. So this is the Grunfeld gambit. I don't know if the name is correct to describe the opening, because almost always black is going to be regaining his pawn. This is a highly theoretical variation as well. Still, there are some games from this position, and it can branch out much sooner. And I would say that this is the best way to fight the Brinkman. Okay, to conclude, after bishop f4, the Brinkman attack, you can suppose that white is trying to avoid the main lines of the Grunfeld and the most aggressive lines of the Grunfeld. White either wants a game in which you are going to be out of your prep, or he wants a game with less attacking chances for black. So remember, bishop g7 is your move. White is going to play e3, and now play c6 if you want a calm maneuvering game. Play c5 if you are prepared to play tons of theory and an aggressive game if you know the theory, a symmetrical pawn structure if you don't know the theory, which won't give too much chances. And after e3, play castles, the Grunfeld gambit, if you want to play the best move. I think this is the best move. You are going to be able to recapture your pawn and have a nice game. So all in all, I don't think the Brinkman attack is challenging for black. When I played the Grunfeld, was really happy to see this. I never faced it in a tournament game, but online I faced it a lot. And I like playing against it. It's just simple to play. Whichever way you choose to play, it's not as challenging as the exchange variation, or let alone the Russian, which is the most complicated of all. We are going to cover that in the next video. Thanks very much for watching. Let me know what you think about the Brinkman attack. Any questions you have, I'm going to try to answer in the comments. If you would like to have a more in-depth look and some tasks related to the opening, visit the Patreon page. The link is in the description below. Thanks very much. Stay tuned for more chess, and bye-bye. Hi everyone, Stepan here. I'm continuing the Grunfeld series with the f3 anti-Grunfeld, which is a very uncomfortable variation for black to face. I have to say, I have played the Grunfeld for over a year, and facing this is always troublesome, and I will give you 2 reasons. Firstly, this gives white an option to avoid the Grunfeld before black gets to play the move d5. Secondly, black has to enter sharp positions. Now, you might say the Grunfeld is sharp anyway, and it is. It often leads to very tactical battles with a center that's blown open and with both sides trying to attack. But the f3 anti-Grunfeld is more aggressive for white, and it's sort of the improved version of the Yugoslav or the English attack, which white can play against the Sicilian, and it's often a situation with opposite side castling in which white is faster, and black cannot avoid it. So after the move d4, black plays the move knight f6, white plays the move c4, black plays g6, and now, as you may know, if white plays the move knight c3, black is simply going to play the move d5, enter the Grunfeld. Now, before we get to the f3 anti-Grunfeld, I would just like to point out that there is a variation after d5 in which white can go for f3, but that's not the f3 anti-Grunfeld. That's the Lutikov variation of the Grunfeld, and it's not as sharp. So if white plays f3 here, we would get bishop g7 and e4, white expands in the center, d4, fe4, and now e5. After e5, taking on e5 is not favorable because black can simply take here, recapture the pawn later on, something like knight d7. So white should play the move d5, black castles, knight f3, and now the undermining starts. c6 undermining the pawn structure. Bishop d3 is the best move, reinforcing the center, and now b5. And there really is no pleasant option for white to keep his central structure. The engines are always going to prefer white, of course, but I think that the Lutikov variation is less good than the f3 anti-Grunfeld, and you don't have the sharp position that the anti-Grunfeld gives. So let's say castles, which is the best move, bc4, bishop c4, cd5. In this position you can play knight d5. This is a tricky variation, and if knight e4, white is simply going to continue with the move queen e4, attacking the knight. f5 is too risky, but knight f6, and now after bishop g5, white is almost winning, or winning, yeah, but after knight takes d5, black doesn't have to blunder with knight takes e4, and the position is equal. White doesn't have a center, and basically it's a symmetrical, well, it's an almost symmetrical pawn structure where white has a 2-to-1 on the queen side, but it's really hard to utilize, and black's Grunfeld bishop is somewhat dampened, but on the other hand, he can open it up with an f5 break later on. So after d4, knight f6, c4, g6, don't play the move knight c3 if you want to play the anti-Grunfeld, play f3 immediately. And now, since your knight hasn't been developed to c3 yet, you haven't given black the option to play the move d5 yet, and if black wants to play the Grunfeld in a Grunfeld fashion, he has to play d5 now, and we are going to get into the madness of those lines in a second. I would just like to point out that black can still go for the same-ish King's Indian with the move bishop g7, and now after e4 we have the move d6, knight c3, castles, and here we are in the same-ish King's Indian. If you don't know the theory in that variation, check out the video. I have made a separate video on the same-ish. So one thing I would like to point out that is if you are trying to enter the anti-Grunfeld with f3, you might still be playing a highly theoretical same-ish King's Indian if black chooses to do that. And in fact, many Grunfeld players have a pet line prepared in the same-ish King's Indian to make sure they could face the anti-Grunfeld with that, because the lines we are going to see now, in my opinion, are worse for black than the same-ish King's Indian, which I also prefer for white. But if black now chooses to go all in, play the move d5, play the Grunfeld against the anti-Grunfeld, we get a very sharp forcing variation for the next 5 moves. We have c takes d5, using the fact that he has an option to take a central pawn for a flank pawn. Knight takes d5, and now if you notice the difference, there is no knight on c3. In the exchange variation of the Grunfeld, where white now plays the move e4, black has the option of capturing on c3. So e4, knight c3, bc3, and black has the Grunfeld center with c3, d4, and d4, white, I'm sorry, but black is able to undermine it with the move bishop g7 and the move c5. In this variation, capturing on c3 is not possible, so after e4, the knight simply has to go back. f6 would be far too dangerous, so f6 is not advisable. The only move for the knight is knight b6. And now you sort of have an Alekhine defense knight from f6 to d4 to b6, and you could argue that the knight is misplaced. Now, what's white's plan? Let's briefly look at this position. Firstly, you have this sort of English Yugoslav attack setup with pawns on e4 and f3. That means that your kingside attack is already ready-made. The move g4 is reinforced, the bishop cannot take, so g4 always is a possibility, and it sort of is a free move in the attack. Secondly, black has played the move g6, of course, since it's a fianchetto position getting ready to get into the Grunfeld, and against all fianchetto positions, h4, h5 is a strong attacking idea. So you have 2 attacking ideas which are ready-made and which black cannot really stop. Furthermore, black is two moves away from castling. His next two moves have to be bishop g7 and castles, otherwise he's going to get just run over. So what white wants to do in this aggressive anti-Grunfeld, the move f3 reinforced the center, defended e4, didn't develop the knight to c3 to make sure that the knight from d5 cannot capture on c3, and white now wants to develop as quickly as possible and put pressure on the king side. What does white do? The same plan you play against the Sicilian defense in many positions. You play knight c3, bishop e3, queen d2. These are going to be your moves. Knight c3, bishop e3, queen d2, castles long. You might wonder, well, isn't it risky to castle kingside with the c file open? Well, you're going to follow that up with the move king b1. That's going to be your fifth move. And from there on, you're just going to try to checkmate black. That's the point of the f3 anti-Grunfeld. So let's continue with the plans for both sides. We know what both sides have to do. Knight c3 for white, bishop g7 for black has to be played, bishop e3, the most natural developing move, wants to play queen d2, wants to castle kingside, go for a kingside, wants to castle queenside and go for a kingside attack. Black castles, queen d2, and now black needs to develop. The move knight c6 is the only move played here. If you can see, the c8 bishop doesn't really have a useful square. The c6 knight, on the other hand, could be a very useful piece. Now, there is of course a downside to this aggressive strategy white is employing. He's leaving a lot of weaknesses on the queen side, and he is leaving a lot of holes on the queen side, particularly the c4 square, which can be very useful for black. If white ever plays the move b3, then you can see that firstly, this diagonal is very weak and the Grunfeld bishop comes to the spotlight. Secondly, a5, a4 would have a target to undermine. So the move knight c6 is very logical because of knight a5 and knight c4. The c4 square is often the weakest point in the Grunfeld defense, especially in the exchange variation where bc happens and there is no pawn to evict the knight. But here as well, since white is castling queenside, it would be unwise to play the move b3. And now white castles. And here we come to the first branching in the position. If you play the anti-Grunfeld against an experienced Grunfeld player, this is what you are going to have on the board. Black now has to choose what to do. There are three moves: f5, e5 and queen d6. f5 is completely mad. It's a very theoretical move. However, it leads to the sharpest positions in the anti-Grunfeld. e5 is slightly more positional, but also very sharp, and queen d6 is considered to be the main line. And I would say that queen d6 requires the biggest knowledge of theory in the anti-Grunfeld. And if you play the anti-Grunfeld, queen d6 is a move you're going to have to learn in detail, because the moves don't come as natural as in e5 and f5 lines. But let's look at the sidelines first. e5 is the least common move, so let's look at that. Of course, taking would liberate the bishop, so you never want to do that. Whenever black plays e5 in these lines, you want to meet it with d5. In this case, of course, it does also chase the knight away. Now, knight a5 here, I'm not sure is a good move, even though you have double support of c4. You want your knight on d4, and you want your bishop to get open. This knight, once it gets to d4, is a permanent knight. If white ever takes on d4, then white is simply going to be worse, because the black bishop is going to be monstrous, and there are going to be a couple of tempi on the c3 knight, and black would then later on play the move d3. So the knight on d4 is a very good piece. It could be shoved away later on with the moves such as knight e2, but we are going to get to that. The most common strategy, instead of knight d2, is simply undermining this structure. And knight d2 could be a useful move, but in fact, let's see that. I'm going to turn on the engine for this one, for knight d2. Okay, I'm sorry about that. Not here, because you lose the bishop, you have to figure out what to do with your bishop first. But later on in the game, if you could play something like exchanging your bishop first, for example, like bishop h6, exchanging the bishop, then knight d2 could be an option, but not here. So the best move, the only move here where your queen and bishop are on pre, if you allow knight c4, as I said, c4 is a huge hole, is the move f4. You want to undermine the defense of the knight. Of course, if black takes on f4, queen takes d4, wins a piece and wins the game. So black continues aggressively with the move c5. Now, taking en passant, firstly would allow b takes, which could reinforce the knight once again and open up the b file. It could also allow knight takes, which isn't as good, but could also be playable, since the queen is still defended on d8 by the knight and by the rook. But I think if en passant, this should suffice. And the b file is open, c5 is coming. If you take here, bishop takes, the knight is... the knight can be defended with c5, and then you could go on from there. The point is, I don't think that it's wise to open up all of these lines and allow black a free attack. I would argue that black is faster in the attack now. Okay, so after c5, the main move for white is f takes e5, undermining the knight from that side. And now bishop g4, a tempo on the rook, is the best move. Taking on e5 can be played, but it's played one move later after the rook moves to e1. Black basically says, I want to remove your defenders from the d file. It could be useful in stopping this pawn. It could be useful in undermining the attack on the knight. So bishop takes e5 now, h3 chases the bishop away, and now you could move the bishop away, but queen h4 is cooler, attacks the rook, you cannot take the bishop. Bishop d3 finally develops the light squared bishop. Now if the knight is ever developed, h takes is actually a threat, rook ac8, and the position continues from here. You can see that it's sharp, that it's imbalanced, there is a lot of piece tension in the center. The g4 bishop is hanging, the d4 knight is still a monster piece, and it's going to be hard to get rid of it. So if you want a tricky variation for black, which is the second sharpest variation, play this. Your knight on d4 is going to be a great piece. If you're white here, note that the engine always gives this as better for white, and if you learn the lines properly, you should have an advantage. So e5 is not the most precise move for black. After castles, I would say the trickiest move for black to play, but if he knows it, he could be fine, is f5. This now leads to my favorite positions in the anti-Grunfeld. This is what I'm preparing to play against Grunfeld players and hoping that they're going to play f5. White has two moves here. One of them is sounder, one of them is more fun. The sounder move is e5, shutting off the bishop. Knight b4 is the most aggressive move, looking to get into the d5 square, where now of course the pawn has moved away, and also threatening a lot of stuff. I mean, it's hard to play with those two knights in the middle of your position. Knight h3 is the main move. Bishop e6, reinforcing the squares, the light squares once again. And you can see that since the pawn has moved to e5, black has a tremendous amount of light squared control. And it's going to be really hard for white to contest that. c4 is forever lost, d5 is forever lost, b3 is weak, a2 is weak, and white could get in trouble on the light squares. So king b1, queen d7, threatening perhaps to come into the a4 square, knight f4, attacking the bishop, bishop f7, saving the bishop, and now h4. Now you go for a kingside attack with the very sharp pawn push on the h file. Rook f to d8, a3, and now the best way for black to continue this position is not simply retreating the knight. If he goes to c6, then I believe d5 is probably winning for white. If you go to d5, a lot of exchanges happen, and white still has an attack along the h file with h5 coming. So the only move to stay in the game is a5. And now, of course, if white takes, a takes b, your knight has to move, let's say, knight to e2. Now you're getting mated, rook a1 check. You have to take, king takes a1, queen a4 check, king b1, queen a2 check. It's defended by the bishop. King c1, queen a1 check, and now king c2. Bishop b3 check. Well, I mean, you have to take. If you take, it's checkmate in one. There's, I mean, So anyway, after the move a5, white cannot take the knight, and white just ignores the fact that black is sacrificing his piece, so you continue with h5. After h5, you're pushing for a kingside attack. g5, knight d3, challenging the knight, knight c4, attacking the bishop, attacking the queen, queen c1, knight takes d3, bishop takes d3, knight e3, queen e3, queen d4, and as it often happens in very sharp lines, a lot of exchanges are going to occur on the board. In this position, the queen can simply take on g5 and not be afraid, h6 and queen f5. Black here can get the pawn back with queen takes e5, and of course queen h7 doesn't bring anything. So sadly, this position is completely equal. Black has the bishop pair, black has 5 pawns, white has 5 pawns, and black has a less safe king. But with the bishop pair, there should be enough compensation. So after f5, if white plays the move e5, you can expect crazy lines with the black knight coming into b4, but they are less sharp than what I'm about to show you now. After f5, my absolute favorite way to play the anti-Grunfeld is h4 here. And h4 is madness. Black should play fe4, and you of course ignore that because you're trying to checkmate. You don't want to take, even though you could, just h5, undermining the structure some more. And if you look at these pieces, it's going to be really hard for black to play this position. gh5 is the best move. You don't want to allow hg. Rook h5, bishop f5. Black now tries to develop, get his bishop to g6 and to defend. Rook g5, a great attacking position. Black should now play bishop g6, and from here, black wins most of the games on master level, but I would always rather be white here. I don't know what you think. I think that this position is great for white, and I think that there are a lot of prospects in this position because the black king is so unsafe. Black wins most of the games on master level, but the engine thinks that white is slightly better. As you can see here, plus 0.7, almost plus 1 if you let it think for a while. So definitely a playable position. So if you want the sharpest line possible, and if black plays f5, go with h4, fe4, h5, gh5, rook h5. After gh5, there is a better move which you can try instead of taking with rook takes h5, which the engine prefers, and that's the move d5. After d5, knight e5, you can now play bishop h6. This pawn is sufficiently defended, and the best move is knight e to c4, attacking the queen, and you continue with queen g5. And you can see that this is getting really sharp. Rook f7, the only defense, rook h4. And after something like queen d6 trying to defend, bishop takes g7, rook takes g7, something like queen h5 can be really dangerous looking at the e8 square. Bishop d7 is the only move here. And once again, I would always rather be white here. Rook takes e4. It's playable for both sides. With perfect play, black is fine, probably because the engines can defend and 2800 players can defend, but somebody 2000 or 1700 is going to struggle to defend this position. Okay, so that was the move f5. So after f5 you can play e5, which is less sharp, or you can play h4, which I would definitely advise. And now the best move for black, if not e5 or f5, is the move queen d6. And this, as I said, is a pretty forcing line which you just have to remember if you are going to play the anti-Grunfeld. Here you can continue with knight b5 or king b1. They transpose. I would recommend the move king b1, it's just safer. Rook d8, developing the rook, and now knight b5. Attacking the queen obviously has to move. The only square is d7. Now you play d5. d5 is the sharpest move. Once again, knight e5 I don't think is the best move. It can be played though, but it's fairly risky. You can then come into c4 and put pressure on the bishop and the queen. In this position, knight e5 has only been played 8 times, and after knight e5, white wins most of the games with the move queen c2, simply defending the c4 square. So after d5, a6 is the best move, because you sort of just chase the knight away and force it to move. White doesn't want to take on c6 and allow a trade and a takes b, because the b file opens up and it's going to be really hard to play after bishop e6. If you can see that, so if d c6, queen d2, rook d2, rook d2, bishop d2, a b5, you can try cb7, bishop b7, but the bishop is still going to come to the diagonal, and even if you drop this pawn, I think that black is going to have sufficient compensation because of the bishop pair, which is aiming towards the white king, and because of the rook on the open file. So the main move after a6 is knight c3. After knight c3, you don't have to move the knight away. If you do move the knight away, that's fine, but queen e8 is the best move now, defending indirectly, because the pawn now cannot take, the queen is loose. So queen c1 saving the queen, and now knight a5. Once again, you could go to e5, but in this position f4 could be a tricky move to face, followed by bishop d4 challenging the g7 bishop. And now h4. This is all theory, and all of this you have to know. Black is aiming at the queen side with his knight, with his queen. Sometimes the bishop can get into play, the rook can get into play via d6 and b6 or c6, and all sorts of attacking possibilities are possible. e6 is the most principled move, just challenging the center. Bishop f4, looking at the c7 pawn, which is a dangerous threat, queen e7 defending, and now bishop g5, an intermezzo move, f6, and the black king is once again weak. Here you can choose bishop d2 or bishop e3. I prefer the move bishop e3, but this now allows e d5, bishop b6, which you have to take. That was the point of bishop e3, cb6, knight d5, and something like king f7. And once again, white is supposed to have a slight advantage, but both kings are unsafe, and it's going to be hard to play for both sides now. If I were black, I would consider a plan like b5 and knight c4, trying to weaken the white king further, develop the bishop somewhere, probably to e6, looking at the a2 pawn, and then something like rook c8. And it's hard to say who is faster and who is better. It's the only thing that's certain is that this position is interesting to play, and it's probably not going to end in a draw, especially on any level below, I would say, 2200. And if you're looking for a fun weapon to fight the Grunfeld with, if you're looking for something to get the Grunfeld player out of his prep, play the anti-Grunfeld. It's really fun. Just remember not to play knight c3, play f3 immediately after, or move 3, yeah, after bishop g7, after g6. So once again, d4, knight f6, c4, g6, play f3 immediately. And once again, black can go for the same-ish King's Indian with bishop g7, but if he goes for d5, remember the first 9 moves, cd5, knight d5, e4, knight b6, knight c3, bishop g7, and now you want to go queen sides, so bishop e3, queen d2, castles. And remember that black has e5, f5, or queen d6 here. Remember how to fight against each one. Thanks very much for watching, guys. I hope you liked the video on the anti-Grunfeld. Extra content coming to the Patreon feed. Visit the link in the description below, and stay tuned for more chess. Bye-bye. Hi everyone, Stepan here. Today I'm going to continue the series on the Grunfeld defense with one of the most popular variations out there, the Russian system or the Russian variation. We are going to be looking at 4 critical moves for black. The variation or the system branches out on move 7. And the Russian system is one of the most positional approaches against the Grunfeld defense. It's also one of the most solid systems, and it's also fairly tricky to play for black, because white, as always in the Grunfeld, or as most often in the Grunfeld, has a very broad center, which is in this case even supported by the queen. The Russian system is characterized by the move queen to b3. Let's get into the opening. So after d4 by white, knight f6, c4, g6, knight c3, black plays the Grunfeld defense with d5. And now the Russian system is not the immediate queen to b3. That's not as good because the e4 square is not as supported. I'm sorry, the d4 square is not as supported by the knight on f3 because the knight is not yet on f3. So instead of that, white plays knight to f3, and on his next move he's going to play the move queen b3. Now, after bishop g7, we could still get c takes d5, we could still get bishop g5, e3, bishop f4, even queen a4 check is a move, but queen b3, and we now have the Russian system in the Grunfeld. It's called the Russian system because it has been pioneered by a lot of Soviet players. Smyslov, Botvinnik, Karpov, Kasparov has played it, but I would namely say Smyslov and Botvinnik would be the pioneers of this, hence the name, the Russian system. And now we have a series of forcing moves, 3 moves which are going to be played. Since the queen is on b3, similar to the ideas in the Semislav, when the bishop develops itself to d3 or to e2, to d3 most often, you then take on c4 because you have a tempo on the piece and the piece has to move again and is forced to recapture. In this case, black does that too. D takes c4, and now queen takes c4. The queen has had to recapture because it was attacked. Black now castles. White plays the move e4, and this is the starting position we are going to be looking at. E4 is the most principled move, and now you get the Russian system center. 2 things we have to notice. White has a very strong center, but black has not a lead in development per se, but a better development. Black has already castled and developed his king side. He only has the queen side to develop. And white has spent time taking up the broad center, developing his knights and moving his queen around. So white is still 2 moves away from castling, which white is going to have to do at some point. On the other hand, black is already prepared to strike at the center, and black is already prepared to try and destroy white's play. We're going to be looking at 4 different moves. We're going to be looking at a6, which is the main line today, considered to be the main line. It's called the Hungarian variation. It's called the Hungarian variation because it has been pioneered by Peter Leko, a Hungarian grandmaster, one of the most versatile players of all time, and before him by his coach Andras Adorjan, also a Hungarian player, so the variation was named the Hungarian variation, and that starts after a6. We're going to be looking at that last. After a6, which is the main move, we also have knight a6 as a move, which is the prince variation. It has the same name as the f3 Sicilian, but named after the same player, but it has nothing to do with the prince Sicilian. We're going to be looking at knight c6, which is kind of provocative, and it doesn't make that much sense. This is called the Bern variation. And bishop g4, which is named after Vasily Smyslov, the Soviet player, the Smyslov variation. Okay, so all 4 moves are kind of interesting. Let's start with bishop g4 because it's the most rare move. Bishop g4 tries to undermine the defense of d5 by attacking the f3 knight, developing the bishop, and weakening the b7 pawn, which can be important in some lines because the queen is going to go to b3. Okay. After bishop g4, one thing that has to be noted is that white is not afraid of black capturing the knight on f3. If white, as in the main move, plays the move bishop e3 and black takes on f3, white is now perfectly happy. He has this sort of Yugoslav or English attack set up, ready to castle queenside, and this rook is coming to g1 or staying on the h file for h4, h5. So this would be almost suicidal. So after bishop g4, white plays the move bishop e3, and now black has 2 moves, in my opinion. Only 1 move is ever played, and the move played is knight f to d7, opening up the bishop and preparing to transfer the knight to b6 to defend the b7 pawn. So after queen b3, knight to b7. One thing that has to be noted is that even the move knight b to d7 is almost never played. There are only 2 or 3 games from this position. I don't see a big problem with this move. In fact, the engine gives it as only slightly worse than knight f to d7, and I think that developing the other knight could be sensible. Now, the critical line which must be factored in, or the critical lines, are queen b3 and e5. After e5, which seems to be the reason why knight f is played to d7, there is a nice variation which I don't see a problem with, which I've analyzed. Knight b6, and now once the queen moves to b3, if the queen moves away from this diagonal, then any knight into d5 is fine. But after queen b3, black now has the move bishop e6, and after queen a3, which should be the best move, knight f to d5, and I want to have black here. I really want to have black here. I've stopped white's pawns from advancing. I have fixed the most dangerous pawn in white's position, the d4 pawn, and I'm looking forward to moves such as c5 if I want to play them, c6 to solidify if I want to play them. I can take the bishop if I want to, and I just think it's a very pleasant position. But the main move is knight f to d7, and let's just look briefly after knight bd7 at the move queen b3. Queen b3 attacks the pawn, but now there's this tricky line with c5, and I really think that taking on b7 isn't good. Let's just turn on the engine for that one. If queen takes b7, you can, first of all, you can win the b2 pawn, but you could also probably take on f3 and be slightly better as black, and now play rook b8. So taking is not advisable. So after queen b3 c5, d takes c5 should be played, and now a move such as queen a5. And once again, I would prefer to have black here. The white king is still in the center. Now in some positions I am threatening to take on f3. At the moment I'm threatening two pawns. Knight c5 is a threat, and knight e4 is a threat. And if white makes a mistake, let's say white plays, I don't know, bishop e2, the knight e4 is triple pressure on the knight, let's say white castles, and I really would like to have the black pieces here. I really like this position for black. So after the move bishop g4, which is considered to be a sideline, this Mislov variation, but I think is really nice for black, white is going to play the move bishop e3, and I would seriously consider putting my b knight to d7, even though e5 is coming, because I have this line with knight b6, bishop e6. I really like that for black. But as I said, the main line is knight f to d7, queen b3, knight b6, transferring the knight to b6, and now we are going to get these Grunfeld knights on b6 and c6, also called Alekhine defense knights. Rook d1 reinforcing the center, and now you can see that the bishop is open. I guess that the move knight f6 makes sense because you get your bishop to be more active. Knight c6, d5, knight e5. For the moment the knight is pinned. Bishop e2 unpins, and now knight f3, gf3, bishop h5. And this is the main line of this Mislov variation, in which the white rook is coming to g1. The bishop on h5 is useful because it stops h4, h5. White still has a strong center, f3, e4, d5, but c6, e6 all could be played later on in the game. In fact, after something like rook g1, black's best move is queen c8, not only looking at h3 because that isn't as useful at the moment, but preparing the move c6. So after something like rook g3, c6, undermining the structure, a4, knight d7, moving in anticipation of the a5 pawn, a5, and well, an equal imbalanced position in which both sides definitely have chances. Both sides have the bishop pair. I would say that black's bishop pair is slightly more active. Black has a weakness to exploit on e5. Black has a weakness to exploit on d6. c5 is not particularly strong. If black can manage to push through c5, b6, pawn takes, a takes, the rook is active and black has a potential to create a passed pawn. So if I would have to choose, I would choose black in this position. And that's why I think that against the main position in the Russian variation, the Smyslov with bishop g4 is one of the best, if not the best attempts. I really like the positions for black. Okay, now let's look at the move knight c6. Knight c6, the Bern variation, is counterintuitive. It does put pressure on the center, but one question you need to ask yourself, and that sort of could be a problem if you don't know what you're doing, is the move d5, after which you simply play the move knight a5. And You attack the queen. If the queen moves to c5 or to b4, which is slightly more common in these positions, you could play the move c6, which I think is fine. You could also play b6, and I think black should be okay, undermining the center. So the move d5 isn't really good. So after knight c6, white continues with bishop e2. As I said, white still is 2 moves away from castling and should be castling as soon as possible. Bishop g4 now, and we get fairly similar positions to the bishop g4 line, but now d5 is played instead of later on. So after d5, you now play knight a5 because knight e5 is impossible, just knight takes e5. Okay, queen b4, as I said. You can interpose bishop takes f3. You don't have to, but it's the best move. Bishop takes f3, bishop takes f3, c6 defending the knight, undermining the structure, castles, queen b6 challenging the queen. White doesn't really want to exchange the queens. If he does, I think his center is going to crumble. So queen a4, knight d7, coming into c5, rook d1, rook fd8, g3, making room for the bishop to transfer itself to any diagonal if need be. h5, trying to stop h4, h5, and also trying to start an attack with h4 himself. Bishop e2. Knight c5, now attacking the queen, queen c2, and now queen b4. Who is better in this position? It's hard to say. I think that the a5 knight is definitely misplaced. There are some ideas with a3, b4 if black isn't careful. In this position it's not possible, of course, because the knight is still loose and pinned to the rook. But white should be slightly more active, although white should be slightly more active, but I think that black's king is slightly safer. So imbalanced but equal once again. But as I said, I don't like the move knight c6 as much. I really think that it's kind of provocative and leads to awkward positions for black, which, if you know how to play them perfectly, if you know a lot of theory, then sure, play them. But they're not natural to play. I think that the move bishop g4 is way more natural. And that the fact that the g file is open in bishop g4 lines doesn't really matter. Get the rook to g1, but it's still biting on granite on g6. Okay, and the move knight a6, the prince variation, is trickier than bishop g4, but makes more sense than knight c6. Now d5 doesn't make any sense, you cannot chase the knight away, so bishop e2. And now the point of knight a6, you play c5. After c5, you should play d5 with white. d5 is the best move. Now let me just show you why this move is something that I like against the Russian system, knight a6 and c5, because some people are going to be tempted to take on c5, and if you take on c5, then the move bishop e6 is very hard to meet. Queen b5, now you continue with rook c8, you don't care about your pawns. Let's say queen b7, knight c5, queen a7, let's give the white pieces to a very greedy player, knight d3 check, bishop takes d3, queen takes d3, something like queen e3, queen a6, and white is never castling. The bishop pair is staring at the queen side menacingly. Sacrifices on c6 are always possible. Something like rook d8 finishing development, and I think white is in trouble. Black is 2 pawns down, but that's completely irrelevant. So after e4, the move knight a6 is really aggressive. Bishop e2, c5. As I said, the pawn cannot be taken. d5 is the main move, and now you immediately start undermining the structure with e6. After e6, taking would be met with bishop e6. Once again, the queen would have to move, so castles, and now ed5, ed5, bishop f5. And I like this setup for white. There's this isolated pawn on d5, which is going to be hard to defend. I think I would always go for a plan with knight e8, knight d6, trying to blockade the pawn. And then my next plan, if I'm allowed, would be a6, b5, expanding on the queen side. In this structure, you can immediately see an advantage for black, a theoretical advantage, and that's the queen side pawn majority, and the fact that white has the isolated the isolated queen's pawn on d5. Those two things, if white isn't careful, could amount to a big advantage over time. Bishop e3, attacking the c5 pawn, queen b6. You don't really want to play b6 to defend because you lose your knight. b3, defending b2, rook f8, rook a d1, rook a d8, getting all the rooks into the center, and now knight a4, attacking the queen. And this is a pawn sacrifice line which you need to be comfortable playing if you want to be playing knight a6. Now, the move rook a to d8 might seem like a mistake if you are unfamiliar with this position. Now let's see what happens. Queen d6, the queen is attacked. Knight takes c5, and now the line goes knight takes c5, bishop takes c5, and you play the move queen d7. And you are eventually going to take the isolated d5 pawn. From this position, all the games ever played on master level were a draw. And the engine gives it as slightly better for black. I think that if you take on a7, just rook a8 would be fine, probably winning the a2 pawn. You can, as you can see, take on d4 immediately, even because there is no e4 or c4 to attack the knight, which is pinned to the queen. So you don't really have to be worried about giving up the pawn in this knight a6 line. This should be fine. But as I said, knight a6, it's aggressive, but after bishop e2, c5, if white knows what he is doing and plays d5, I don't know. Black is okay, but I prefer the move bishop g4. Now, let's look at the main line, a6, the Hungarian variation. This move a6 has a clear purpose of chasing the queen away with b5, and that's just very sensible. Getting the bishop to b7 after that and playing c5 are going to be the next steps. So a6 is sort of a high-class waiting move, also stopping any bishop b5 or knight b5 if that's important. And now white has three approaches to this position. The first one is simply retreating the queen in anticipation of the b5 tempo. b5, e5. And now knight f to d7. You want to support c5. e6 is the main move. The problem with e5 is 6. And now this line is similar to what we are going to see in the e5 line, they transpose. F takes e6, and now white can take, as we are going to see in the other line, but the main move is bishop e3, developing before that. Knight f6, defending the pawn, and now a4. And white plays energetically, trying to undermine the queen side. For the moment, this is a threat because the rook is loose. So I think that white is slightly more comfortable here. Now, if you start after a6 with e5, we get to the same position. e5, a tempo on the queen with b5, queen b3, knight f d7, and once again e6, f e6. You have to take, as black, you cannot allow something like e takes f7. And now let's look at queen takes e6, which is less good. Queen takes e6 check, king h8, queen e4, moving away in anticipation of the knight moving and also attacking the rook. Knight b6 defending the rook and opening up the bishop. Queen h4. And this, according to the engines and according to theory, is a draw, and that's why queen takes e6 is not popular. If you look at the material situation, both sides have 6 pawns. White still has to castle his king, and it's pretty risky to leave it in the center for the moment. The d4 pawn is loose as well. Knight c6 by black, attacking d4. Bishop h6, stopping knight takes d4 because the rook would be hanging on f8. So e5, putting extra pressure on d4. And now bishop takes g7, king takes g7, queen takes d8, king takes d8, d5, rook e8, and you basically have a draw on the highest levels. And this is why nobody on the highest levels takes on e6 with the queen. So after f takes e6, bishop e3 is the move for white. Knight f6 defending the pawn now. a4. And the main move here, of course, you don't want to allow your pawn to be lost. So ba4, rook a4, knight d5, bishop c4 attacking the knight, and now c6 defending. And this being the main sideline in the Hungarian variation, I think white should play that instead of the main line. I kind of hate black's pawn structure. For the moment, white has 5 pawns, black has 6 pawns, but one of these is going to be lost, and it's really hard to keep those pawns. Now, it should be equal according to theory, and with correct play, black should be equal and fine. You have a great bishop on g7, you have an isolated pawn on d4, which is a target. All of your pawns are defended for the moment, but try developing your knight. I mean, it's really hard. Try developing your bishop. I don't like these pieces. I don't like the c8 bishop in particular. The bishop has absolutely no scope. You develop the knight, you lose the pawn. You take anything here, you open up this very dangerous battery. So you can never hope of moving this knight away. And I like white. I like white's chances here. Okay, and the main move after a6 is not queen b3 or e5. It's simply bishop e2. And the move bishop e2 is way more sensible, but it leads to positions which are easier for black to play than the ones we just saw. Now, black has the same plan. a6 was played with a purpose, a6, b5. So b5, queen b3. And now the difference is that you have time to play the move c5. e5 hasn't been played, as in the two previous variations. c5. White should take, of course. Any d5 can be met with c4, 3-2 pawn majority. So dc5. Now there are two moves, bishop b7 and bishop e6. I kind of prefer the move bishop b7, which is a sideline. And this is what's most likely to happen on the board if you play against the Russian system. So here is where you are going to have to choose your move. After dc5, either bishop e6 or bishop b7. Bishop b7 castles, knight takes e4. Now white has 6 pawns, black has 6 pawns. White has this passed pawn on c4, but it's not really going anywhere with this bishop and with this knight. You have to take on e4 though. Bishop e4, bishop g5, knight c6 developing, queen e3 attacking the bishop, queen d5 defending, rook a1, queen e6, bishop h6, and now the main move is bishop c2, which I don't really like that much. The point is that after rook d2, you take the queen, you isolate black's pawn. Of course, if black doesn't do anything, you are going to just take. So if white doesn't do anything, so this can also happen. Takes, and now rook d2. In which case, I think white should also be fine. The bishop is coming here and staring at this pawn, so we are going to have a strong blockader on the d5 pawn. But after rook d2, we get this exchange, bishop takes e3, bishop f5, and once again, a passed pawn for black on c4, but easily blockaded at the moment as well. And it's not that easy to remove the blockade. It's not that easy to defend with b4, and your queenside pawns are loose, and black's bishops are staring at the queenside, and black has much better bishops. That's why I like the move bishop b7. Now, the main move is bishop e6, gaining a tempo on the queen, queen c2, and now knight bd7 developing, attacking the c5 pawn, bishop e3 defending, rook c8, attacking the c5 pawn again, and now rook d1 indirectly defending it again because the knight cannot move. And now b4 is the move, the main move, and now we get a long theoretical line. This is the most theoretical variation in the Russian system, which if you're going to play the Russian system with white, you have to know. If you're going to play the Grunfeld with black, unfortunately, you have to know b4, knight d5, and now bishop takes d5, e takes d5, knight takes c5. You might be wondering, well, isn't the knight loose? If bishop takes c5, then queen a5 wins the bishop and threatens to win the queen. So that wouldn't work. So after knight takes c5, white doesn't capture the knight, of course. The material is equal. So he castles. Now knight c e4. Bishop takes c5 was actually a threat now. Queen d3. Queen d6, stopping the d-pawn from ever moving. And this is what you get. A lot of tension in the center. Black has two knights, white has the bishop pair. Black's pawns on the queen side are further advanced, but that doesn't really mean that much. If queen takes a6, you might be wondering, then rook c2 is fine. Ample compensation, bishop d4, defending the pawn. And now knight c5, attacking the queen and provoking queen takes d6. E takes d6, bishop b5, and now knight f to e4. And 6 pawns for white, 5 for black, but black's knights are, in my opinion, much better than white's bishops here. and black has a lot more activity, and d5 is loose and b2 is loose since the bishop is now of course getting traded off. So black is inevitably going to win the b2 pawn, and after that a2 is going to be loose as well. As opposed to other variations in the Grunfeld defense, most of these lines in the Russian system, especially the Hungarian with a6, lead to equal positions. That's why, if you know the theory with black, it's really not likely that you are going to be worse. Study these lines, choose one move, a6, knight a6, knight c6, or bishop g4. Once again, bishop g4 is my favorite, but that's subjective and I just like the positions. And yeah, I'm going to play a training game in the Russian system today. As I said, I'm going to record one theoretical video every day, and every day I'm going to try to play a training game in the exact variation which I'm recording. So this evening I'm going to publish the video in the Russian system. Thank you very much for watching. If you would like to arrange a training game with me with one of the variations I will be playing in the future, follow the link in the description below. Thanks very much. Stay tuned for more chess. Bye bye.